Hello, fellow sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're lying beneath a ceiling of stars, washing dishes in a dim kitchen, or spiraling softly towards sleep, this space is yours. Because tonight, we are tracing the lost roots of our resilience, the ancient survival skills that kept Homo sapiens alive while every other human species vanished. This is cinematic history and slow science for thoughtful minds. It's the untold story of how we endured 100,000 winters, in silence, with firelight, with memory. But it's not a story of stronger tools or sharper minds. It's not about conquest. It's about care. And, if you're someone who finds calm in long-form reflections like this, look just below this video. The button marked subscribe is there. Tap it if you like. You can always unsubscribe later. The little bell next to it will quietly let you know when a new story arrives. This kind of support helps this small channel survive. Without it, we simply can't keep making these. Where are you right now, by the way? What time is it for you? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a quiet reminder we're all listening together. Also, you're welcome to drift off at any time. Timestamps are in the description if you'd like to find your way back later. Now, we begin with a fire and a wound that healed. We are the last of many, not the only to have walked upright, not the only to wield fire or shape tools or bury the dead, but the only ones left. Today, when we look in the mirror, we see a face that once had siblings, cousins, entire branches of the human tree, now gone. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, all vanished, their voices extinguished, their stories left half-told in the sediment, and somehow, against all odds, it was us, Homo sapiens, who remained. This is not a story of dominance, not a tale of triumph in the way we so often tell it. It is a story of extinction and inheritance. It is a mystery with no single cause and no clear ending. Why us? Why did this one species, fragile and new, survive where so many others did not? What fragile thread did we grasp? And what winds tore the others away? To even begin to answer, we must understand that we were never alone. For most of our deep prehistory, we shared this world, sometimes with as many as 6 other human species at once, scattered across continents like echoing experiments in evolution. On the island of Flores, a tiny hominin only 1 meter tall made stone tools and butchered animals while elsewhere. Great-browed Neanderthals hunted mammoth herds beneath cold European skies. Deep within the caves of the Altai Mountains, Denisovans left behind a single child's finger bone and a few ancient teeth, enough to reveal an entire people, once widespread, now gone. Each of them was a variation on a shared theme: upright posture, expanding brain, opposable thumbs, stone tools. Each was born of the same ancestral clay and carved by different winds. Homo erectus, tall and hardy, was the first to wander far from Africa more than 1 million years ago. They reached the islands of Indonesia, the deserts of China, and perhaps even the shores of Europe. Homo heidelbergensis, thought to be our common ancestor with Neanderthals, passed down its knowledge in silence, leaving behind axes and shelter frames like skeletal whispers of mind and memory. And Neanderthals themselves, so often misrepresented, were not brutish caricatures, but capable toolmakers, social beings, and perhaps singers of forgotten songs. What must it have felt like, then, to be one among many? To gaze into a stranger's eyes and see something uncannily familiar, but not quite the same. To share landscapes with others who walked like you, hunted like you, feared the dark as you did, but were not you. The past was never lonely. It was crowded, polyphonic, filled with voices shaped by wind and stone, by glaciation and chance. It was a world of convergences and divergences, of many human paths running in parallel, never knowing how few would reach the horizon. And in the silence that followed, in the long fading echo of those who did not make it, a question grew darker and sharper. What does it mean to be the only one left? It means we carry ghosts in our bones, not just metaphorical ones, but genetic traces, fragments of extinct peoples folded quietly into our DNA. A Neanderthal grandfather here, a Denisovan great-aunt there. We did not merely outlast them, we met them, we lived among them, we touched, exchanged, and remembered. Some encounters were violent, others were tender. We do not know the details. But the legacy of those meetings endures not in myth, but in mitochondria. Still, the meetings were not enough to save them. One by one, the others disappeared. Their last footprints washed away, their last fires gone cold, and there were no cameras to witness it, no scribes to record the final moment. Extinction, when it comes, does not announce itself. It unfolds in silence, with fewer births, smaller groups, failed hunts. Perhaps a bad winter, perhaps a disease, perhaps the slow unravelling of memory in a world that no longer favours your kind. What happens when a people disappear? What does the earth reclaim first? Their shelters, their bodies, or the meaning of their names? The extinctions that thinned the human family tree were not all sudden. Many were slow, imperceptible declines that unfolded over thousands of years. Denisovans, for all their genetic contributions, left almost nothing we can hold. Neanderthals, once dominant in Europe and Western Asia, dwindled to small isolated bands before vanishing entirely around 40,000 years ago. Homo erectus endured the longest, nearly 2 million years, but even their flame eventually flickered out on the remote Indonesian island of Java. There were others too. Homo naledi, discovered in the dark, narrow shafts of South Africa's rising star cave system, posed riddles about burial, brain size, and consciousness. Homo luzonensis, found in the Philippines, showed us how much we still do not know. Each new fossil unearthed seems to whisper, "We were here too, remember us." But memory is fragile. The earth swallows what it can. Bones crumble, tools erode. A single tooth might be all that remains of a species that endured for tens of thousands of years. Their stories vanish unless we fight to piece them back together, and even then we guess. Were they less intelligent? Not necessarily. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They mastered fire, wore clothing, hunted strategically. They may have spoken in full language, they may have mourned their dead. The line between us was thin, porous, blurred, and still. We remained. They did not. So the question sharpens again. Not, why did they die, but why did we survive? Was it a matter of luck, of timing, of favourable winds and fertile ground? Was it our minds, our culture, our social bonds, or something stranger, an accident of migration patterns, of pathogens, of catastrophe? And what do we do with a victory we never asked for and can barely explain? We search for patterns in the ashes, we follow trails that disappear into ice and dust, and we listen, not just to the bones, but to what is missing from them. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, not suddenly, not as a finished product, but as a slowly shifting form, a cloud of evolving populations scattered across forests and savannas, growing in complexity as they moved and mingled. We were not alone, even then. And yet, by 60,000 years ago, small bands of us began leaving that continent, crossing rivers and deserts, pushing into new frontiers. What did we carry with us? Not sharper spears, not bigger muscles, but perhaps a kind of flexibility, a softness of mind that allowed us to bend without breaking. Archaeological clues hint that early Homo sapiens developed symbolic thought earlier than others. Decorated beads, ochre-stained bones, geometric carvings on tools. These are not weapons. These are signs. Signs that the world was not only hunted or harvested, but remembered, imagined, transformed. Could it be that imagination itself was a survival trait? We do not know for certain. But we do know that Homo sapiens adapted to an astonishing range of environments in a relatively short span of time. From the frigid tundra of Ice Age Europe to the steaming forests of Southeast Asia, from the salt flats of Australia to the Andes high plains, we did not simply endure these places, we reshaped ourselves to meet them. Some scientists call this behavioural plasticity, others call it culture. Either way, it may have been our lifeline. And there is another clue, perhaps the most subtle, the most invisible, but also the most powerful. We helped each other. Evidence from ancient burial sites shows that some individuals lived for years with broken bones, degenerative diseases, or impairments that would have made solo survival impossible. They were not left behind, they were cared for, nursed, fed, protected. This is not mere biology. This is something deeper: empathy, obligation, love. The survival of the weakest among us may have made the whole stronger. A society that remembers its wounded may be one that survives its winters. What kind of mind chooses to carry the injured, to bury the dead, to mourn? What if the secret to our endurance lies not in strength, but in softness? In our fragility, paradoxically, we may have become the most durable. Not because we conquered the world with tooth and claw, but because we wove ourselves into one another. Because we whispered knowledge through generations, learned from failure, told stories that turned danger into metaphor and pain into meaning. Because we remembered. And when the world changed, as it always does, we changed with it, dragging our memories behind us like fire in a basket of reeds, never letting it go out. Fire, after all, is not only flame, it is symbol, it is warmth held against the void, and just as we carried fire through cold and night, so too did we carry language, memory, rhythm. Each campfire was a flicker of continuity, each shared story, a thread that bound one generation to the next. Perhaps that is what set us apart, not our tools but our metaphors, not our strength but our stories. But stories alone are not enough. Others had memory, others buried their dead. The Neanderthals too knew grief and tool-making and perhaps song. They hunted in teams, built shelters, used pigments. The Denisovan survived in brutal mountain climates. Homo erectus, enduring for over 1.5 million years, crossed oceans without maps. So we return again to the riddle. Could it have been timing? When Homo sapiens spread outward from Africa, climates were shifting. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Landscapes became unstable, unpredictable. In that volatility, perhaps the generalist had the edge over the specialist. A mind comfortable with improvisation may have thrived where certainty died. And perhaps it wasn't a matter of being better, but of being lucky. Luck is a force too often ignored in our search for meaning. A volcanic winter here, a pandemic there, a drought, a famine, a migration corridor that opened just long enough for one group to pass through. In deep time, small events ripple into permanent consequences. A few thousand years of misfortune can extinguish a lineage. A well-timed migration can launch an empire of descendants. But even luck has its requirements. To benefit from fortune, one must still be alive. One must still be watching the horizon, still searching, still moving. And that movement, that restless curiosity, may have been the ember at the centre of our survival. What drives a species to keep walking? To cross ice bridges and deserts and oceans, carrying children and stone tools into the unknown? Fear, perhaps, but also something more. A hunger not only for food, but for possibility. A compulsion to find what lies beyond the ridge, over the water, beneath the sky. That wandering instinct may have kept us just far enough ahead of collapse, just far enough apart from catastrophe, just close enough to one another to adapt again. Because even when we moved, we remembered. We brought seeds of memory into every new place, and when we encountered others, Neanderthals in caves, Denisovans on the wind-scoured steppes, we didn't only fight, we merged, we exchanged. A few rare encounters, a handful of shared children, and so, though they vanished, some part of them continues in us. We are not pure, we are not alone in our blood, we are mosaic. And maybe that's what it took. Not purity, but openness. Not certainty, but the ability to learn from what was different. In a world teeming with risk and change, the ones who endured may have been those who could absorb the strange, adapt to the unfamiliar, and reweave it into something livable. Perhaps the last human species standing is not the most exceptional, but the most permeable, the most capable of becoming new without forgetting the old. Not a conqueror, but a collector. And so we remained. Not because we were destined to, not because we deserved to, but because somehow, in the fragile interplay between mind and mystery, we kept going. The others are gone, their last voices lost to moss and wind. Yet, in our genomes, their echoes still murmur. In our faces, subtle hints of other stories reside. Brows, skull shapes, immune adaptations, shadows of encounters in caves long collapsed. We are the walking archives of lost peoples, but that knowledge carries weight. To be the last is not a triumph, it is a responsibility. Because survival without remembrance is a second extinction. We are not the end of the story. We are a continuation of gestures and instincts, of cooperation and fear, of questions once asked by other mouths beneath other skies. Our ancestors were many. We are their dream that did not end, a dream still being written in every shared glance, every fire lit, every child born into a world they didn't choose. What does it mean to be the last? It means we must remember that we were never meant to be alone, and if we are to remain, not only as a species but as something worth becoming, then we must carry the weight of those forgotten survival skills: empathy, curiosity, adaptability, community, the very traits that allowed us to pass through that great sieve of deep time. Because survival was never guaranteed. It was earned, again and again, in the dark, by hands that helped, by voices that told stories, by people who saw the world changing and changed with it. And perhaps that is the beginning, not the end, of understanding what it truly means to be human. Fire, after all, is not only flame. It is symbol. It is warmth held against the void. And just as we carried fire through cold and night, so too did we carry language, memory, rhythm. Before the wheel, before the plough, before any written word carved its path into stone, there was fire. Not found, but feared. Not made, but watched from afar. Coursing down the sides of mountains, seething through dry grass, splitting the sky with lightning and leaving the forest blackened and quiet. Fire was older than us, older than thought. It roared before language, destroyed before creation. For early humans, it was an alien sun brought to Earth, terrifying and divine, and yet, somehow, we reached toward it. What must that first moment have felt like? When a branch was pulled from the edge of a wildfire and its ember survived the journey back to camp. When warmth could be summoned, not waited for. When food could be made tender. When the night was no longer absolute. This was not merely the use of fire, it was the beginning of mastery. The evidence comes to us in quiet fragments. Layers of sediment stained with ancient charcoal, hearth pits darkened in symmetrical rings, bones cracked and blackened where no natural burn should reach. In South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, archaeologists uncovered ash layers dating back more than 1 million years. Controlled fire, purposeful. Repeated, Homo erectus perhaps, crouching beside smouldering coals, coaxing light from decay. Later, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens would carry the flame further. Hearths appear again and again in archaeological strata, organised, deliberate and central. Not scattered, but placed. Often in shelters, often renewed. Ashes layered like pages in a long-forgotten book, each fire telling of hands that gathered, sparks that leapt, nights that passed without freezing. But what changed in us when we stopped fearing fire and began inviting it into our lives? At first, the practical gains seem obvious. Fire softened meat and roots, breaking down fibres that teeth alone could not conquer. It unlocked nutrients. It made more of the world edible. This changed digestion itself, freeing up energy, shortening gut lengths over generations, and feeding larger brains. In a strange twist of evolutionary economy, fire outside the body allowed expansion within the skull. Is that how the mind began? Fed by flame? Beyond diet, fire drove predators away. A circle of light around the camp meant safety from the glinting eyes that prowled at its edges. It became a mote of heat, a signal to stay away. And for those within the ring, a signal to gather. So what happened in the moments just after meat was cooked, after danger was held at bay? What did they talk about, those first fireside watchers? Or did they sit in silence watching sparks drift upward like the souls of trees, dreaming in new directions? Because around fire something shifted in the rhythm of human life. The sun no longer dictated the boundaries of the day. The darkness no longer swallowed all things whole. Fire carved out a new kind of time, time after the hunt, time beyond the gathering, time that belonged not to survival, but to something softer. Reflection, play, speech. Before fire, night was dangerous. It was a wall. But with fire, night became a room. The shadows it cast danced on walls and skin, and perhaps it was in those flickering outlines that the first metaphors were born, the way a hand moves before flame, elongated, warped, become creature or myth. Fire turned the mundane into the magical. Around it, the day no longer ended with dusk. The mind, freed from the constraints of ceaseless movement and foraging, began to spiral inward and upward. Could it be that consciousness, in the way we now understand it, required fire to unfold? We know that communal fires extended the hours in which humans could interact without distraction. No hunting, no fleeing, just warmth and others. And into that prolonged time, something poured. Language, perhaps, or the shaping of it. The first murmured myths, the first laughter, the first names for stars. From an evolutionary lens, this expansion of social time created immense pressure for cooperation. Those who could hold attention, share knowledge, teach skills, those who could connect, thrived. Around fire, a new kind of human emerged, the storyteller, and in that role, information passed across generations with greater fidelity than genes alone ever could. Because fire did not just cook food, it cooked memory, it simmered knowledge until it thickened into tradition, and it made space for the intangible, for rules and rituals, for shame and wonder, for ancestors and gods. Archaeological sites such as Kisum Cave in Israel and Gesher Benot Yaakov reveal not just burned bones, but patterns, repetition, intent, flint arranged near ash, activity zones where tools were shaped, meat processed, embers tended. These were not chaotic camps, they were organised, mindful. This suggests not just use of fire, but shared understanding of its rhythms, a choreography of flame. Fire demanded cooperation. It had to be fed, shielded, passed. And in that care, a new kind of responsibility emerged, not only to the flame itself, but to one another. The failure of one hand could mean the cold for all. This may have forged early social contracts, invisible but binding. Was fire the first shared project? And if so, what did we give up in return for that warmth? Perhaps in bending fire to our will, we accepted its terms, that we would always need each other, that the night would never again be truly silent, and that our minds, once opened, could never return to the dark. The hearth became more than a source of heat. It became a centre, a place to return to, a gravitational pull within the chaos of the world. And once it was lit, it was difficult to let go. Even nomadic groups began to carry embers with them in carefully tended bundles, wrapped in bark or held in hollowed bones. Fire became a thread that connected place to place, moment to moment. It was continuity itself, and around it, the human world began to shape itself. Shelters were built with the hearth at the heart. Stone circles anchored tents and lean-tos. Ashes accumulated in soft white layers that marked years, even decades of occupation. To walk through the ruins of such a place today is to trace the orbit of ancient feet, always around the fire, always returning again and again as if in ritual. Because fire taught us rhythm, taught us that some things must be done in order, that a flame must be fed not all at once but slowly, that patience brings warmth, that time is a cycle, not a line. And into that rhythm came song. What might it have felt like to hum beside a fire, just to pass time? What instincts stirred when voices joined, when rhythm was echoed, when memory was given shape in repetition? Storytelling may have begun not as entertainment, but as a necessity, a way to remember hunting paths, to teach danger, to explain thunder and death. But once begun, it did not stop, because story, once born, is addictive. It binds, it gives shape to the shapeless. Around fire, humans began not just to survive, but to mean. And as language grew richer, as stories grew longer, fire became a stage. Faces lit from beneath, eyes flickering with reflection, shadows exaggerating gesture. Every tale was a performance, every teller a magician of memory. The night became a theatre of ancestors and spirits, of cautionary fables and origin myths. Did they know they were inventing something new? Or did the stories feel as old as the fire itself, pulled from it like flame from embers? The evolutionary benefits were profound. Storytelling encoded survival knowledge in emotion. It made information sticky, memorable. A tale about a boy who disobeyed and was eaten by a lion is remembered more deeply than a dry warning. Around the fire, rules were set not by force, but by narrative. Shame, pride, courage, all shaped by the stories told beside the crackling logs. And it's no accident that even today, we are drawn to the flicker of flame, that candles still haunt rituals, that we gather around televisions and campfires with the same expectancy, that bedtime stories are told in low voices, in darkness, with the soft rustle of breath and the memory of distant coals. Because some part of us never left that first ring of fire. Some part of us is still listening for the crackle, the hiss, the soft sigh of wood collapsing into ember, listening not just for warmth, but for presence. Because fire, more than any other force, turned space into place. It created orientation in an otherwise indifferent world. Beyond its light was the unknown. Within it, belonging. The first camps may have been little more than circles of stone around smouldering centres, but their meaning was immense. They marked territory without walls, community without fences. The hearth was both weapon and welcome, a border against predators, and a beacon for kin. Even predators at first must have lingered near its edge, curious, uncertain, eyes glinting at the border between fear and fascination. And perhaps humans felt something similar, because fire demanded respect. It punished recklessness. It rewarded attention. It shaped not only our environments, but our behaviours. Children had to be taught its rules, not abstractly, but through proximity. Burns, warnings, lessons etched in scar and soot. And yet, it drew them close. The glow of fire called all eyes. It was hypnotic, always moving, always changing, impossible to ignore. It trained focus. It trained patience. And what else was it training? Fire, some researchers argue, may have even shaped our sleep. In communal settings, the need to tend the flame at night likely encouraged staggered sleeping patterns. Some rested while others watched. This may have offered evolutionary advantages: early warning systems, reduced vulnerability, shared alertness. It may also have been the cradle of dreams, because dreams require space, psychological space, emotional distance, and fire gave that. It gave room for imagination to unfurl beyond the immediate, to wonder what lies beyond the forest, to ask what happens after death, to reach beyond the visible. In this way, fire was both tool and teacher. It taught that the world could be transformed, not only by muscle, but by intention. Raw meat became food, silence became story. Danger became ritual, and this act of transformation, this alchemy, became sacred. Across nearly every early culture that left records, fire holds a place of reverence. In myths, it is stolen from the gods, gifted by spirits, carried across oceans. It is personified, prayed to, fed. It is not merely respected, it is loved. Because fire was not only survival, it was presence, a constant, a companion, a silent witness to our becoming. And yet, it was also a reminder of fragility. One night of rain, one failure to gather kindling, one distracted child, and the fire died. And with it, the warmth, the safety, the story. Fire was life, but also dependence. It made us stronger by making us need each other more. What does it mean that our most powerful ally was something we could never hold? That our lives came to orbit a force both fragile and fierce? And what parts of ourselves were shaped in that orbit, forever warmed, forever burned, forever bound to the light? Even now, when the modern world glows with electricity and hums with unseen current, the shadow of fire remains. Campfires, candlelight, the hearths we build into our homes, though no longer needed, still occupy the central space. We cook with fire. We mourn with fire. We celebrate with fire. We still gather at its edge to mark transitions: birth, love, death, remembering. It has never stopped being sacred. But perhaps what fire truly gave us was not warmth, not safety, not food, but time. Time to become. Time to reflect. Time to grow the slow language of thought, to sculpt meaning out of nothing but heat and dark. It was fire that made the night ours. That let us sit without movement and yet remain alert, connected, aware. Fire gave us the pause between doing and sleeping, a pause wide enough for imagination to slip in. And what happened in that pause reshaped our species. The first myths, the first philosophies, the first traces of art, all may owe their beginnings to this quiet space carved out by firelight. It is no coincidence that so many creation stories begin with darkness, followed by a spark, that the divine so often comes as flame. That enlightenment is still described as illumination, because to sit beside a fire is to watch the world remake itself. Fuel becomes flame, flame becomes ash, ash becomes memory. It is a cycle, and we are drawn to cycles, the rise and fall of breath, the spiral of seasons, the crackle and silence of embers. Fire trained us not only in how to survive, but in how to wait, how to observe, how to listen. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy it left in our bones, not just intelligence, but attention. To be still enough to see the movement in the quiet, to be humble enough to learn from something that can both destroy and comfort, to recognize, in the smallest flame, the largest truths. Fire demanded mindfulness before we had a word for it. It became a mirror reflecting both our fragility and our brilliance. In it we saw what could be built and what could be lost. We saw transformation itself, raw to cooked, dark to light, fear to myth. And when the fire burned low and sleep crept near, and stories faded into the hush of breath and coals, something lingered, a thought, a question, a dream. Perhaps that was the first religion, the first philosophy, the first awareness that the world was larger than it seemed. Because even as the fire dimmed, the mind kept glowing, and in that flickering space between flame and shadow, humanity began to awaken. Because even as the fire dimmed, the mind kept glowing. It glowed not alone, but in reflection, in response, in quiet attunement to the breath beside it, the eyes across from it, the subtle shift in posture that meant fear or safety or curiosity. Long before writing, before even structured language, humans learned to read one another. Not as animals read the rustle of leaves for danger, but as minds read minds. Somewhere beneath the soil of time, buried deeper than bones and unreachable by tools, a revolution was unfolding in the invisible, a revolution of awareness. What does it mean to know that another being has a mind? To feel not just your own hunger, but to imagine the hunger of another. To plan not only your actions, but to anticipate theirs. This capacity, what researchers now call theory of mind, was not a single spark, but a slow burn, and yet it may be the most profound development in our evolutionary history. The earliest signs are not obvious. They do not appear in the fossil record with clarity. There is no skull shape that proves empathy, no bone that testifies to self-awareness. But there are clues, scattered in the architecture of behaviour, in the coordination of complex hunts, where silence and patience replace chaos, in the burial of the dead where grief implies an imagined interior, in the passing of tools, not dropped, but handed with intention. Because once you understand that others have thoughts, you can begin to shape them, not through force, but through gesture, expression, attention, and eventually language. But before language, there were eyes. What happened when one early human met the gaze of another, not in fear, but in understanding? Eye contact is a strange thing. It invites and unnerves. It exposes and reveals. To lock eyes is to acknowledge. And in that acknowledgement, something sacred began to grow, shared mind. Not just cooperation, but communion. Not just imitation, but resonance. This was the beginning of together thinking, of mental synchrony. And once it began, it never stopped. Because the benefits were immediate and immense, cooperative hunting became exponentially more effective when minds could coordinate. One flank distracts, one flank drives. A third waits in ambush. The prey is surrounded not by accident, but by a plan born not from instinct, but from shared imagination. A plan that requires trust, timing, and mutual belief in the unseen intentions of others. And when the hunt succeeded, something even more astonishing happened. The food was shared, not just among the strongest or the fastest, but across the group, with elders, with children, with the injured. It was not equality, it was something stranger, something more deliberate, a kind of social calculus that asked not only who earned this meat, but who needs it most. What kind of mind chooses generosity? What kind of world is made by imagining not only your own survival, but someone else's? It is a world held together not by force, but by understanding. And understanding is invisible. It moves beneath speech, beneath motion, beneath the surface of things like a current in still water. You cannot see it, but everything it touches moves differently. A shared mind does not announce itself. It flows between people as quiet adjustments, as synchrony, as waiting for one another. It is the flick of a glance that sends a message, the way one hand pauses, knowing the other will take over. From this emerged a kind of choreography, unspoken but precise. The kind of behaviour that only makes sense if you assume others are thinking too. And so, gradually the human tribe became a network of minds. Not isolated, but linked. Not in every moment, not perfectly, but often enough that the structure held. Nowhere was this more visible than in the care of children, because raising a human child is a task far beyond what a single parent can manage alone. Our infants are among the most helpless in the animal kingdom, born too early, utterly dependent. Their brains are still wiring themselves, still learning how to even survive their own bodies. But perhaps this very helplessness is what forced us into deeper sociality. We became what anthropologists call cooperative breeders. Not just mothers raising children, but aunts, uncles, grandparents, siblings, alloparents. A word for the many who help, a word for the structure beneath the surface. And with that structure came emotional depth. Affection that extended beyond the biological imperative. Loyalty, long memory, favour returned years later, the beginnings of culture. Because once the mind is shared, so is experience, so is knowledge, so is pain. Imagine a wound, a real one, deep, dangerous, one that would take weeks to heal. In most animals that would be the end, but not for us. Archaeological evidence shows that even severely injured individuals were kept alive, fed, protected, cleaned. That's not instinct, that's imagination. That's someone looking at a broken leg and thinking they will walk again. They are still part of us. This kind of care requires memory of the past, but more than that, it requires faith in the future. And where does that faith come from? Perhaps from the very thing that was beginning to emerge in the minds around the fire. Language, not yet in the form we know it today, but in rhythm, gesture, repetition, sounds tied to meaning, words that reached beyond the here and now, words that carried time. Language did not evolve just to describe the world, it evolved to bind us to one another, to make thought shareable, to give the invisible structure. That may be the most astonishing gift language ever gave us, not just words for things, but frameworks for meaning. It allowed us to label the intangible, to separate the past from the present, to name fear, to name love, to name the sacred. Without language, time is a fog. With it, time becomes a path. But where did language begin? Not with grammar, not with vocabulary lists or syntax. Perhaps it began in the breath between gestures, in the tone of a call, in the mimicry of animal sounds, in the rise and fall of a mother's voice soothing an infant, sound tied to meaning, meaning passed between bodies, rhythm that could be remembered. Some researchers believe early language emerged first in the body, in gesture, in facial expression, in the shared silence between two people who already understood each other. Before we spoke, we pointed, we touched, we mimed. But even these simple movements carried profound implications, because to point is to assume someone else is watching. To mime is to assume someone else will interpret. Gesture, like language, is built on shared context, on shared mind. And as vocal cords grew more flexible, as breath became rhythm, as mouths shaped vowels, the air itself became a canvas. We painted our thoughts into sound, sound that could move across space, across generations. But we didn't just describe the world, we imagined it together. Language allowed us to share what wasn't there, what might be, what could be, what must never be. Through it, we created memory, warning, prophecy, law. Through it, we passed along not just what we knew, but how we felt. And through that transmission, our minds began to align. We became a species whose survival depended not on the size of our muscles, but on the fidelity of our conversations. Because the better we communicated, the more we could coordinate. Hunts became strategies, dangers became stories, conflicts became rituals, cooperation deepened, identity solidified. And somewhere in that long arc, another miracle occurred. We began to tell each other who we were, not just in terms of roles, hunter, gatherer, parent, child, but in terms of inner life, preference, memory, dream. We narrated ourselves into being. And what happens when two minds share not just food, but story? They become entangled. A memory shared is a memory multiplied. A fear spoken aloud is a fear halved. A dream echoed becomes a blueprint for action. Language blurred the line between self and other. Could this be the origin of empathy? Not just feeling for another, but feeling with them, stepping into their world, seeing through their eyes, hearing through their metaphors. In that moment, the mind ceased to be a private organ. It became a space of invitation, a place others could visit, a bridge built entirely of breath and trust. And the crossing of that bridge changed everything. Because once thoughts became transferable, the tribe itself became an organism of many minds, each enriching the others. What one saw, all could learn. What one feared, all could prepare for. Knowledge pooled, thickened, refined. A new kind of intelligence emerged, not in the skull of one, but in the interaction of many. This was not individual genius. This was distributed cognition. And perhaps this was our first great invention, each other. In a hostile, shifting world, where ice came and went like the breath of mountains, no one person could know everything. But together, humans began to store information outside of their bodies, first in elders, then in ritual, then in language, then in myth. Memory became collective, strategy became tradition, the group itself became a brain. But no brain can function without trust. To rely on another's words, to follow another's eyes, to believe another's fear, these are not automatic responses. They are acts of faith, and faith requires consistency. It requires predictability. It requires honesty, or at least the believable illusion of it. Over time, this pressure may have shaped not just behavior, but biology. We became wired for connection. The hormone oxytocin, the mirror neuron systems, the automatic mimicry of faces, these are not accidents. They are the traces of minds sculpted by millions of years of togetherness. Our joy in synchrony, our pain at isolation, our instinct to comfort, these are the fossils of our interdependence. And language, once born, expanded that interdependence. It allowed us to share not just things, but selves. It allowed us to argue, to teach, to deceive, to forgive. It opened the door to cooperation on a scale never seen before. Families became clans, clans became bands, bands became cultures, and beneath it all a single fragile premise endured, that we could understand each other. That when I say danger, you see what I mean. That when I name the stars, you follow my finger. That when I tell you a story, you do not just hear my words, you build a world inside your own mind. What kind of creature can do that? What kind of mind can hold another mind inside itself? Perhaps this is why loneliness hurts so much, because to be human is not just to be alive, it is to be shared, to be known, to be witnessed. The pain of isolation is not a flaw, it is a signal, an ancestral alarm that once meant death. Without others there is no memory, without others there is no meaning. And so we return to that early fire, not for heat, but for company, not for light, but for the gaze across the flame. The silent question in the eyes of another. Are you with me? And for hundreds of thousands of years we answered, yes. With a nod, a hand extended, a gesture of food passed from one mouth to another, with laughter, with stories, with songs hummed beneath stars too ancient to name. We answered with presence, with recognition, with shared breath. Because survival did not belong to the strong or the solitary, it belonged to those who could enter the mind of another. The human miracle is not simply that we think, it is that we think together. Long before cities, before symbols etched in stone, before temples and laws and flags, there was this invisible web, fragile, vast, and utterly real. The web of shared mind. It stretched across fires, across generations, across space. It allowed us to become more than ourselves. It allowed knowledge to grow, not in one mind, but across many. It allowed us to trust futures we would never see. And as language deepened, so did identity. We learned to say we. That word is the seed of everything. It contains kinship, memory, duty, and love. It is the word of mothers and of movements. the word of plans and of promises. And once it existed, we were no longer alone, not in fear, not in hope, not even in death. This is why our ancestors painted on cave walls, why they buried their dead with ochre and beads, why they sat in circles to tell the old stories again and again. They were not just preserving information, they were reaffirming connection. They were saying, you belong, you matter, you are one of us. And we still do it. In every bedtime story, in every shared meal, in every whispered comfort and shouted celebration, the shared mind continues, unseen but undeniable. It lives in language, yes, but also in silence, in the knowing look, the held hand, the stillness between notes in a song only two people remember. This is how we survived, not by outfighting the world, but by outlistening it, by tuning ourselves to each other's needs, by shaping a social world where memory was distributed, emotion was communal, and knowledge was sacred. We are not the strongest animal, we are not the fastest, we are not the fiercest, but we are the most entangled, and from that entanglement came civilization. But long before it came cities or tools or names in history books, there was a small group of early humans, sitting in the dark, listening, not to the wind or the beasts, but to one another. That was the real beginning. The first technology was not fire, it was trust. The first invention was not the spear, it was the story. And the first cathedral was not stone, it was the space between two minds, bridging the silence. Somewhere, deep within the architecture of your brain, is a ghost map, silent, invisible, inherited. It does not name the rivers or mark the trails in ink. It does not chart elevation or compass direction. But it is there, like a sleeping language, a dormant gift passed down from ancestors who walked not by luck, but by memory. Because survival in the deep past was not only about endurance or invention, it was about knowing where the water flows after the first spring melt, where the berries ripen in the shadow of the ridge, where the mammoths return when the cold winds shift. It was about the landscape, not as backdrop but as scripture, and the mind, not as mirror, but as archive. What kind of mind remembers the migration of caribou across 300 miles? What kind of child is raised to know the shape of snowdrifts, the flavour of roots beneath volcanic ash, the direction of winds by the tilt of tree limbs? Long before there were maps, there were minds, and they were not blank slates. They were shaped by evolution to hold geography in exquisite detail. In the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure buried within the folds of the temporal lobe, neurons fire in patterns when a person or an animal moves through space. In rats, these are called place cells. In humans, they build a model of space itself. And yet, this was not simply internal. It was relational. It was born not in isolation, but in motion. Imagine the ancestral child, 3 winters old, walking behind her mother. She does not yet speak, but her eyes trace the land. The shape of the rock that shelters the deer. The bend in the stream that sings louder in flood. The taste of salt on a southern wind. She absorbs it all, and without being told, she begins to know. This is cognitive mapping, not a conscious act, but a layering of experience into memory, etched into the neural flesh by necessity. Because forgetting meant death, confusion meant hunger, hesitation meant the cold, and so the human brain, unlike that of any other animal, became a cartographer, not of streets and borders, but of pathways and patterns, not of cities, but of cycles. This is why we remember routes through unfamiliar places after only a single walk. Why we recall the feel of a bend in the trail decades after we last walked it. Why some people can navigate without a compass, guided only by the sun and the pull of the land. Because we were once wanderers, yes, but never lost. Our wandering was informed, strategic, ritualized, and when the stars changed or the rivers moved, we adapted, not by guesswork, but by generations of observations encoded in the mind, the body, the tribe. What does it mean to carry a map you cannot see? What does it mean to trust your feet to remember what your eyes have forgotten? It means to live by a clock that cannot be seen, one wound not by gears, but by instinct, by pattern, by a whisper passed down the bloodline. In the Paleolithic world, the year was not divided into months. It was partitioned by migrations, by bloomings, by disappearances. Time was ecological. It moved with the grasses and the game. And so, to survive, our ancestors became students of rhythm. The salmon run meant plenty. The flight of birds meant change. The thickening of the elk's coat meant winter's breath had begun to stir again in the north. People did not stumble through these cycles. They followed them with precision. Honed over generations, the migrations of humans were not wandering but returning, each year back to the bury grounds, the birthing valleys, the sacred crossings of rivers swollen by melt. It was memory, not muscle, that ensured survival. In these migrations, oral knowledge was embedded like fossils in breath. Elders became living atlases. Songs held the order of stops. Dances mimicked the movements of herds. Each gesture, each syllable was a coordinate in a living geography, a way to carry the world with you even as you moved through it. And this memory was communal. It could not be hoarded. To forget a path was to endanger the whole, and so children learned by walking, by listening, by repetition. Memory was a practice, a ritual, a constant reenactment of orientation. Some groups, like the Aboriginal Australians, encoded vast distances into songlines, musical maps that linked sacred sites with narrative. To walk the song was to walk the land. Others used stones, carvings, bones, but all shared the same core idea. That landscape was not just physical, it was storied. Imagine the moment an elder points to the moon and says, "When it is that shape, the animals cross the pass." Not superstition, observation, not myth, data, made durable by metaphor. In the Arctic, Inuit navigators could find their way through endless whiteout by the feel of snow underfoot. In deserts, the San people of southern Africa read animal prints and wind shifts like pages of a living book. In the forests of Borneo, Dayak trackers could retrace steps by the broken bend of a twig no wider than a finger. These were not primitive talents. They were refinements of attention. The landscape rewarded those who noticed, and the ones who noticed passed their noticing on. This is how the mind became seasonal, how memory became migratory. Because the body needed food, but the mind needed orientation. To know not just where you are, but when you are. And in that knowing, the land itself became a kind of clock. The world was not a backdrop, it was a teacher. Each rock, each current, each season had a lesson, and those who lived by it listened closely. But listening alone was not enough. What one person learned had to be passed on, precisely and beautifully, or it would vanish with them. This was the beginning of oral transmission, not as mere storytelling, but as survival technology. To live in prehistory was to live in dialogue with memory. The stories were not entertainment. They were mnemonic maps, sung in cadence and repetition to hold complex ecological knowledge within rhythm and rhyme. A tale about a trickster animal might secretly encode a migration pattern. A creation myth might describe the origin of a particular river's floodplain. Every word had a double life, one in spirit, one in data. This duality, myth as map, was how humans learned to make memory last beyond a single lifespan. Consider the elders gathered at dusk, their voices low and deliberate. Around them, children sit wide-eyed, not realizing that the tale of a mountain spirit's sorrow is also a description of the terrain's fault line, that the warning about a restless sea god's anger refers to tides and storms that follow lunar cycles. These were libraries of survival, written in metaphor, carried in the mind, and those who carried them were sacred. Because forgetting meant losing the path, and losing the path meant losing life. Across cultures, there are echoes of this reverence. Polynesian navigators memorized thousands of star positions and ocean currents through chant. Native American tribes told of animals that guided migrations, their movements mirroring the seasonal behavior of prey. In the tundras of Ice Age Europe, carvings on bone recorded moon phases for hunting and mating seasons. All of these were ways of making the ephemeral, time, movement, observation, solid, transmissible, repeatable. Our ancestors became custodians of time itself. They lived by recall and retelling, by walking in the footprints of those before them, sometimes literally. A track in the mud was not just a trace. It was a message left by a living mapmaker. Following it was an act of trust, of faith in the memory of another. And yet, memory is not perfect. Landscapes shift, rivers change course, herds alter routes. Knowledge must be updated, resung, retold. Each generation edited the stories, folded in new observations, discarded what no longer fit. Oral tradition was not static. It was adaptive. It evolved like the species itself, slowly, through iteration and need. In this, we see the earliest glimmer of what would become science, the careful preservation and testing of information through experience, retold in forms that endure. And it was art too, because to remember something deeply, it must move you. It must carry emotion, image, sound. The best stories were those that made the heart remember what the tongue must later repeat. The land lived in story. The story lived in sound. And between the two, humanity found its compass. But a compass is more than direction. It is a sense of belonging. To know where you are is to know who you are. And as early humans learned to name the world, they also rooted themselves within it. Geography became genealogy. The cave was not just shelter, it was grandmother. The river was not just water, it was the spine of the people. Over time, memory of the land became memory of self. This is why nomadic people so often describe land as kin. Why sacred mountains are treated like ancestors. Why to cross a river wrongly without ritual is to offend something more ancient than law. It is not superstition. It is recognition. That survival was always about relationship, and relationship to persist must be remembered. Early humans marked places with carvings, with ashes, with bone. Not to claim ownership, but to ensure return. A firing at the base of a cliff was a breadcrumb trail, a bookmark in the book of the earth. Each mark said, "We were here," and more importantly, "We will be back." The landscape became layered with human intention. And just as the body carried memory in muscle, and the brain in neurons, the land began to carry memory in symbols. A cairn, a scarred tree, a stone turned upright, each one a voice in a silent choir of recall. In some cultures, these markers became sacred waypoints. In others, they were hidden, known only to the initiated, passed along like passwords to the future. To the untrained eye, the landscape was empty, but to those raised within its grammar, it was dense with meaning, and this meaning bound the group together. To share memory of the land was to share responsibility. The stories were not just maps, they were contracts. If the forest had fed you in the spring, you left it fallow in summer. If the river's bend held fish in abundance, you honoured it with ritual. These were early ethics, born not of law but of gratitude. And gratitude is a form of memory. It keeps us from taking without thought. It roots us in time, because the land remembers what we forget. It remembers the scars of overhunting, the ghost trails of vanished herds, the silence of once busy nesting grounds, and though it speaks in slow, invisible tongues, erosion, bloom, collapse, our ancestors learned to listen, not with ears, but with attention, with patience, with humility. They knew they were not above the landscape, but within it, and so they built their lives not on conquest but on recall, each journey a retracing. Each season a return, each story a renewal, and in this repetition meaning deepened. Memory became more than information, it became ceremony. The land, more than a resource, became a storybook passed from one generation to the next, not to own, but to live inside. Because when the world itself becomes the story, survival is no longer about escape. It becomes continuity, a trail of breath, of footsteps, of names murmured into wind. And when the body fails, when the bones lie still beneath familiar trees, it is the memory of the land, passed forward, that keeps the soul walking. This is how humans endured, not just through fire or tools or muscle, but through memory woven into geography. Even today, in cities and grids, beneath asphalt and algorithms, that ancestral memory stirs. We remember shortcuts through side streets. We feel disoriented when the skyline changes. We trace favourite paths with almost sacred repetition. The hippocampus still sings when we know where we are, and when we lose that knowing, when place becomes abstract, when the land is no longer legible, we feel it. An ache, a kind of forgetting, a disconnection not only from ground, but from history, from self. That is why indigenous knowledge remains so vital, not only as heritage, but as memory systems honed over tens of thousands of years. These are not quaint traditions. They are memory technologies. They remind us that knowing the world requires listening and remembering and walking again and again the paths that made us. In the prehistoric past, those paths were often unmarked, but they were not invisible. They lived in the way an elder's eyes scanned the horizon. In the way children learned to read a forest by birdsong and breeze, in the songs hummed low during dusk, when the sky turned gold behind the hills. This was not simply memory, it was presence, it was belonging. It was a human mind extended outward, not just through tools or language, but through the very shape of the land. And perhaps this is what remains most miraculous, that even without writing, without maps, without metal, our ancestors knew the world so well they could walk through it with their eyes closed. They carried the land inside them, and we, their descendants, still carry echoes of those echoes. So the next time you stand on a trail and feel something stir, something older than words, older than thought, you are not imagining it. You are remembering, not from your life, but from the life before yours. And in that moment, the past is not behind you. It is beneath you, still speaking, still guiding, still waiting to be walked once more. In the great unfolding of deep time, where megafauna thundered across plains and rival hominins wielded heavy frames and larger tools, it was not the strong who inherited the earth, but the small. Not the most numerous, not the most powerful, but the most subtle, the most sparing, the ones who learned to need less. What does it mean, after all, to survive? Not just a season, but an epoch. Among the branches of the human family tree, many species rose with brilliance and vanished without sound. Neanderthals with thick bones and fire-hardened spears, Denisovans whose genes echo today like ghost frequencies in the DNA of scattered peoples, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis. All of them gone. All of them shaped by place, by climate, by their moment in evolutionary time. But what remained? Us. And not because we were the loudest, not because we were the largest, but perhaps because we were the lightest to carry. It is easy today to imagine progress as expansion, more, bigger, faster. But survival, especially in prehistory, often meant the opposite. Fewer mouths, fewer needs, groups that could vanish into the tree line before a storm, tribes that could migrate with only what they wore and what they remembered. Imagine waking each day with only what you could carry and needing nothing more. Would that feel like loss or liberation? Early Homo sapiens often travelled in bands of fewer than 25, sometimes as few as 12. These were not arbitrary numbers, they were ecological equations. A group too large would exhaust a landscape's edible roots and game. A group too small might not survive a harsh winter or defend against predators. So they struck a balance, not by choice, but by necessity. This was not a philosophy, it was physics. It was the shape of what life allowed. Within these miniature societies, relationships deepened. Each person mattered. Each role, gatherer, tracker, toolmaker, storyteller, was vital. With no one to spare, cooperation wasn't virtue. It was structure. There was no room for waste, no time for luxury, but there was space for flexibility. When food grew scarce, they moved. When rivers dried, they remembered another. To be small was to be mobile. To be mobile was to be alive. And being small changed more than movement. It changed the mind. What happens to thought when the world is never fixed? When there are no walls, no fixed addresses, no concept of hoarding? How does the brain adapt when the only permanence is change? The answer may be found in our adaptability, in our creativity, in the very fact that our species could not only survive these conditions, but thrive in them. What kind of intelligence grows in the shadow of scarcity? Not the kind that invents extravagance, but the kind that refines need. There is a quiet genius in living lightly. The early Homo sapiens who outlasted extinction did not do so by conquering their environments, but by attuning themselves to its limits. When food was uncertain and weather unpredictable, success was not measured by abundance but by sufficiency. A full belly today and a plan for tomorrow, nothing more, nothing less. Their lives were not empty, they were edited. Minimalist living was not aesthetic choice, it was adaptation. Less muscle mass meant lower caloric requirements. Lighter frames cooled faster, carried further, and fatigued more slowly. In environments where large prey were rare or migratory, humans that required fewer calories could persist through long intervals between kills. Even the design of tools reflected this ethic. Simple, sharp, multifunctional. No adornment for adornment's sake. Only precision, only function. And this economy extended beyond the physical. Food sharing, for instance, was a strategy not of generosity alone, but of calorie budgeting. A large portion divided among many reduced risk. If one group failed to forage or hunt, another could offset the deficit. Reciprocity became insurance, and in this exchange, relationships deepened. Dependency was not a weakness, it was a distributed form of resilience. But more than food and tools, it was time itself that was carved into leaner shapes. In ecosystems where daylight and warmth were short, early humans became masters of rhythm. They followed migrations, tracked ripening seasons, and learned the deep intervals of bloom and barrenness. Every movement had a purpose, every pause a reason. Their knowledge was not generalized, it was hyper-local, intimate. To live this way meant understanding not just the land, but the cadence of its breath. Even sleep and waking adapted to the economy of need. Modern hunter-gatherer groups show polyphasic patterns, naps interspersed with alert periods, resting in cycles tuned not to clocks, but to danger, opportunity, and community need. It wasn't about maximizing output. It was about optimizing presence. To sleep lightly, to eat moderately, to walk far but carry little. This was the dance of survival. In that simplicity, something astonishing occurred. Freed from the burden of excess, early humans honed attention. They could read animal tracks like letters, sense a weather change in the silence before wind. They memorized the moods of trees, the tempo of insects, the flavor of soil. Their minds were not distracted by clutter, but sharpened by scarcity. We often associate scarcity with suffering. But scarcity also focuses, it disciplines, it reveals what is essential. And from that revelation, a different kind of intelligence blooms, one not born of accumulation, but of selection, of choosing what to carry, of choosing what to let go, and to live this way, to carry so little and know so much, was not only a method of survival, it was a philosophy, written not in words but in footsteps. The art of becoming small was not about hiding, it was about listening, about moving with such precision through the world that one left no more trace than a falling leaf. To be small was to be invisible when needed, quiet when it mattered, and fast when it counted. Predators didn't see these humans until it was too late. Rivals didn't hear them pass. Where larger hominins may have needed to defend fixed territory or secure dense stores of food, early Homo sapiens simply left. They melted into the trees, curved behind hills, altered their paths with the subtle elegance of wind. When survival was uncertain, the best tactic wasn't confrontation, it was evasion. In this way, mobility became a kind of armor. A large group cannot pivot quickly. A burdened tribe cannot flee easily. But a light-footed band of 12, carrying only what they needed, could reverse a journey before a storm, or skirt a conflict long before it reached their camp. Speed was not measured in how fast they ran, but how lightly they planned. This mobility shaped even the way they hunted. Cooperative ambushes required stealth, coordination, silence. The loudest species, the most aggressive, might win a fight, but lose the season. Quiet, coordinated effort, where individuals could predict one another's actions and respond fluidly, meant higher success rates with less injury and risk. And again, it was the smaller groups who mastered this art. Their silence was not emptiness, it was signal. Even in death they spoke sparingly. Burials were often modest, a few stones, a tool, a bone tucked beside the ribs. This wasn't for lack of feeling. It was reverence without excess, mourning without waste. They did not forget their dead, but they carried them forward in memory, not in monument. Lean survival created something more than physical efficiency. It fostered a kind of group intimacy we struggle to understand today. In small bands, no one was anonymous. There was no crowd to vanish into, no surplus of caretakers. Every pair of hands mattered. Every absence echoed. When someone fell sick, the group adapted, When a child was born, the group flexed. Cohesion wasn't optional. It was survival itself, and it made the species more durable. Groups that functioned like organs in a single body, distributed, interdependent, sensitive, could recover faster from shocks. They were anti-fragile. Their very looseness made them strong. If one branch failed, another split away, carrying the memory and rhythm forward. This was not the civilization of empires or monuments. It was the civilization of persistence, of the whisper instead of the roar. And in that softness, in that refusal to overextend, Homo sapiens found something precious. Not only a way to survive harsh ages, but a way to endure them with grace. Scarcity did not harden these people. It softened them into cooperation, into attunement. There was little room for ego in a world that could kill with cold or hunger. Status did not come from hoarding, but from giving well. The most respected were often those who knew the terrain best, who sang the quietest songs, who wasted nothing, not meat, not time, not kindness. This humility was its own kind of power. To live without surplus meant every object held meaning. A flake of obsidian might serve as knife, mirror, or symbol. A single animal hide was coat, cradle, shelter, and map. Everything had to be portable. Everything had to justify its place in the pack. Over time, this gave rise to a sparse aesthetic, one that prized utility, yes, but also memory. Objects weren't just tools, they were stories, and stories were, in many ways, the lightest cargo of all. As bands moved across grasslands, through forests, over ice, they carried histories not in scrolls or stones, but in breath. A spoken phrase, a hum passed down, knowledge compacted into rhythm and sound. The land was read aloud, the seasons encoded in tale. Scarcity forced the distillation of wisdom into forms that could travel without weight. Language, ritual, and song. To be small meant you couldn't afford to carry the unnecessary. But you also couldn't afford to forget. That tension between weightlessness and memory shaped their minds. Imagine what kind of child you'd raise in such a world. One who learned not by reading, but by walking. Not by abstract rules, but by watching. Their intelligence would be embodied, practiced, layered into muscle and mood. They'd grow up learning the signs of animals by the curve of tracks, the taste of wind. And as they aged, they'd become living libraries. No need for shelves, no space for clutter. The knowledge would move as they did. This way of life forged humans who were lean in more than body. They were lean in thought, quick to adapt, fast to notice, unafraid of solitude. Their resilience wasn't brute endurance, it was elegant calibration. They didn't need fortresses, they didn't need abundance, they needed only each other, the land, and the ability to keep moving when the world shifted beneath them. And when food returned, or when safety was found, they celebrated not with excess, but with presence, a fire, a story, a meal where each bite was earned and shared and savoured. Because that's the other truth of living small. It teaches you how to feel big joy in small things. The crunch of a root after days of hunger, the sound of footsteps returning, the warmth of another sleeping body beside you in the cold. These were the riches of a people who owned nothing and therefore lost less. In a world where so many species faded into the cold silence of extinction, Homo sapiens whispered forward, not with banners, not with conquest, but with subtlety, with light feet and light needs, with a willingness to be shaped by the land rather than to reshape it. Their success was not written in gold, but in persistence, in the fact that they were still there when others were not, in the way their children woke up to another dawn, in the way their memories travelled farther than their bones ever could. And so we must ask again, what kept us alive when the others fell? It wasn't strength. Neanderthals were stronger. It wasn't territory. Denisovans spanned mountains. It wasn't numbers. Most of the time, we were few. But we adapted. We carried little, but remembered much. We moved often, but forgot nothing. We needed less, but gave more. And this combination of leanness and connection, of efficiency and care, proved more durable than brawn or breadth. Even today the echoes remain, in the urge to wander, in the calm that comes when we clear a space. in the way a whispered story can travel further than a shout. Modern life prizes accumulation. But deep within us is the ghost of a different rhythm, one shaped by scarcity but not diminished by it, one that learned how to thrive in smallness, because smallness made room for others, for each other, for the land, for silence. The art of becoming small was never about shrinking. It was about precision. It was about remembering that survival is not always won by force, but often by grace. And in that grace, tucked into the folds of history, into the footprints of a band moving gently across a ridge, we find the quiet thread that binds our past to our present. We were small, we were few, but we were enough. And because of that, we are still here. Long after breath has left a body, it may still speak, not in words, but in the unmistakable grammar of fracture and healing, of deformity born over time, of old wounds that never should have mended, but did. What does it mean when a skeleton shows a crushed leg bone that fused back together? What does it mean when we find the remains of a child born with a congenital illness, who lived years beyond what nature alone would have allowed? What does it mean when the evidence of life is not in perfection, but in endurance? It means someone stayed. It means someone carried, cleaned, fed, waited. In the ancient record, healing is not inevitable. It is not passive. It is a decision, a community decision, that this life, weakened though it may be, still matters. It means time was taken away from hunting, from guarding, from the daily labour of survival, to tend to another. And that is the astonishing truth whispered by these broken bones. The weak did not always perish. They were often saved. How far back does this quiet ethic stretch? At a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, nestled among ancient cliffs, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man now known only as Shanidar I. He lived some 45,000 years ago, likely among Neanderthals. His injuries were catastrophic. A withered arm, likely paralysed from early trauma, blindness in one eye, partial deafness, and signs of a severe limp. Yet the bones reveal something far more haunting than pain. They reveal that he lived for years in this state. He was not left behind. He was not discarded as unfit. He was fed when he could not hunt. He was moved when he could not walk. He was watched over while he slept. And through this, we glimpse something that breaks the stereotype of brutish ancestors grunting in caves. We see something achingly human. We see compassion, not as an abstract idea, but as a biological reality etched into bone. Shanidar I is not alone. The fossil record, when read not as a list of artifacts but as a ledger of choices, shows that this impulse to protect the vulnerable was not a deviation. It was a trait, a feature, one that may have shaped our species more deeply than toolmaking or fire. Because to survive with a broken body in the Pleistocene meant someone else had to absorb your cost. And over time, those who learned to carry the injured, not leave them, may have carried forward something even greater, the foundation of society. What happens to a species when kindness becomes a survival strategy? It rewrites the rules of endurance. It makes space for weakness without dooming the whole. It allows for time to heal, to adapt, to grow, and time is everything. Time is what separates a wound that festers from one that closes. Time is what lets a child learn. Time shared freely is one of the greatest currencies of community. And in the archaeological record we find that time was given again and again. At Dmanisi, in Georgia, an ancient site over 1.8 million years old, researchers uncovered the skull of an elderly Homo erectus individual. Their teeth were missing, entirely, not decayed, gone. And yet, they had lived long after the loss. That's not possible without soft food, without care, without someone else chewing or preparing their meals, and that someone else means a society, not of strangers, but of people who took responsibility. This is not what we expect from a species still closer to apes than to ourselves, but perhaps that expectation has always been wrong. Perhaps the spark of what we now call humanity didn't begin with tools or symbols or language, but with the impulse to stay, to feed, to carry. Perhaps tenderness, not dominance, was the true evolutionary leap, and those who practiced it, who bound their fates to one another, even when inconvenient, gained something immeasurable: resilience. Because when disasters came, as they always did in fire and famine and cold, those who cooperated could absorb the blow. A sick hunter might rest while others filled his place. A mother recovering from birth might lean on her sisters or her brothers, or the elders who'd seen it all before, and even when losses came, they were shared. They were not faced alone. This sharing wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. It allowed early humans to become more than the sum of their parts. A group that worked in concert, like an organism with many limbs, could flex, recoil, and heal in ways that solitary creatures could not. And with every crisis weathered, that group grew wiser, stronger, more cohesive. Every act of aid was also an act of memory, a lesson learned, a story retold, a blueprint passed forward. Even the sick became valuable in other ways. They remembered where herbs grew, they warned of old dangers, they raised children, shaped tools, sang songs, told stories. A healed body wasn't a waste. It was proof of investment, of time and patience and faith, a walking memory of what the group could endure together. And so, in these buried bones, we see not only damage, but design. A society built not for perfection, but for persistence. This was not without its burden. Compassion, while noble, is metabolically expensive. Every mouth fed that does not hunt means greater pressure on those who do. Every wounded companion slows the pace of movement, adds risk in escape, requires extra firewood, extra food, extra vigilance. Evolution tends to prune what does not contribute. So why did it not prune this? Because the return was greater than the cost. The biology of compassion is not metaphor, it is measurable. In the stress levels of individuals who feel secure in their group, in the oxytocin that floods brains during acts of care, in the calmer hearts of those who sleep near kin, these things add up. The cared for are more likely to survive. The caregivers too gain hormonal rewards, greater bonds, reduced anxiety, and in the long arc, more reliable allies. Cooperation is chemical, and when we look at the long timeline of our evolution, the pattern becomes clear. Species that survived longest, travelled furthest, and adapted most fluidly were not the most aggressive. They were the most cohesive. Wolves, elephants, whales, each, in their own way, evolved around the principle of social endurance. And humans were no different. If anything, we pushed it further. We evolved not just to care for offspring, but for non-relatives, for friends, for the injured and the old. This required new brain circuits, more memory, more empathy, more ability to read need without words. It required emotional attunement, to understand pain not through self-interest but through shared feeling. And so our brains grew not just for thinking, but for feeling, to read a face, to hear a tremor in a voice, to detect the micro-expressions that signal fear or hope or sorrow. These are not luxuries, these are survival tools. A mother who senses illness in her child before symptoms show saves a life. A leader who notices fatigue in the group before collapse can change course. Compassion isn't soft, it's anticipatory. It is the radar of a species that survives together. Even our hands were shaped by care. The dexterity that allowed us to carve flint also let us dress wounds, braid rope, swaddle infants. Touch is knowledge, touch is medicine. And for early humans, the ability to soothe, to comfort, to clean, to carry, may have been as essential as the ability to hunt or gather. There is a tenderness in our evolution, often overlooked. It is written not just in the artifacts we leave behind, but in the structure of our nervous systems, in the neurochemical scripts of bonding and sorrow. We are wired to care, and while that wiring sometimes hurts, when others are lost, when the burden is great, it also builds something that cannot be scavenged or stolen. It builds continuity, it builds trust, it builds us. Because care is not simply about survival, it is about meaning. In the ancient world, where each day was a negotiation with hunger, cold, and danger, what anchored people was not just warmth and food, it was each other. To be injured and still wanted, to be sick and still sung to be nearing death and yet held, not abandoned. These are the things that stitched humanity together. Burials speak this language. Even in Paleolithic graves tens of thousands of years old, we find bodies carefully placed, sometimes adorned with ochre or beads, sometimes curled as if in sleep. This is not disposal. This is ritual. This is grief made visible. It tells us the dead were not waste. They were remembered. And remembrance is a form of care that transcends utility. It suggests love. It suggests legacy. And in that love, a society finds identity. When archaeologists discover the grave of a child buried with a carved figurine, or an elder laid to rest with tools once held, they see more than objects. They see connection. The recognition that a life, however short, however fragile, mattered. The weak survived because the strong stayed. And the strong stayed because they too knew weakness would one day come for them. It was mutual aid, yes, but more than that, it was a rehearsal for mortality. To care for another is to confront one's own impermanence. To see a wound and imagine your own, to see a child and imagine their future. This is what separated Homo sapiens from species that survived only by instinct. We imagined, we anticipated, and we invested. This emotional depth left no tools behind, no bones of its own, and yet it is the clearest trace of what made us human. It is the whisper that flows through fossils. We were not alone. We were accompanied. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. Enough to survive frost and famine. Enough to mend the broken. Enough to remember the gone. There is a cave in the Dolomites, high in the Italian Alps, where the skeleton of a teenager lies tucked beneath a stone shelf. Scientists believe he was disabled from birth, yet he lived more than 10 years. That cave is not near water or shelter. It is hard to reach, yet someone brought him there. Carefully, lovingly, and when he died they buried him where the light would fall. That light still falls, and through it we see what those ancient ones once saw, not a burden, but a person. Not a body, but a story, a presence, a memory. And in that memory, the quiet truth of who we are. To survive together was never just a matter of muscle or mind. It was a matter of heart. A species that protects its wounded, that grieves its dead, that carries the sick and slows its pace for the old. That is not a species designed for domination alone. It is a species built for continuity, for care, for kinship, for meaning. Today we look at the bones of those who lived long ago, and we wonder how they endured, how they made it through winters of ice and summers of thirst, through predators and plagues, through treks across unknown continents. But maybe the answer was never just in spears or fire or flint. Maybe the answer was in each other. And this is the echo we must not ignore. In every broken femur that healed, there was a campfire flickering nearby, and someone watching, waiting, hoping. In every toothless elder still alive, there was laughter, there was patience, there was love. These things are not abstractions, they are evolutionary tools, and they worked. They worked so well that we sitting here now exist because of them. We are the children of care. Our ancestors didn't merely pass down genes, they passed down practices, habits, values, and among them, perhaps the most vital of all, do not leave the wounded, do not abandon the weak, stay, help, heal. That is not sentiment, it is survival. And in today's world, where we sometimes imagine that only the strongest thrive, or that to struggle is to fail, we might listen to what the bones still whisper, that survival was never meant to be solitary, that strength was never about going it alone, that the line of our species bent toward endurance not through brutality, but through tenderness. So the next time we imagine our ancestors huddled beneath the stars staring into the firelight, we might remember that they didn't just bring warmth to the night, they brought hands to hold, voices to soothe, time to give, and when one of their own could go no further they carried them, and then they carried their memory. Even now, beneath our skin and in the marrow of our lives, their choices live on. Every act of kindness, every patient wait, every burden shared, it is all a continuation of what they began. And so the bones do not lie still, they speak, they reach, and they remind us, we survived, because we stayed. Before there were books, before there were words, before even the first idea was etched in ochre on a cave wall, there was a child, watching. A pair of hands cutting meat, a slow twist of wrist to shape stone, a spark coaxed from flint and dried grass. The child did not invent fire. The child imitated fire's keeper, and from that silent echo something far more enduring than flames was born. Culture. Not a thing, but a pattern, not a law, but a rhythm, carried not in the genes, but in the gestures, inheritance that bypassed blood and rooted itself in memory. What does it mean to be human? It is easy to answer in flesh and form, to speak of opposable thumbs or upright stride. But these were shared by many of our cousins. What truly defined us, what lifted our ancestors from the roar of instinct, was the uncanny ability to see an action, to remember it, and to do it again. Not because the body demanded it, but because the mind decided it. Imitation, then, is not a lesser form of learning. It is the mother of all teaching. Inside the human brain, buried deep within its folds, lives a quiet architecture, a system of mirror neurons discovered only in recent decades, yet present for millions of years. These cells light up not only when we perform an action, but when we see someone else perform it. Watching becomes doing, observation becomes rehearsal, and suddenly memory wears another's skin. But how did this happen? How did evolution make room for mimicry? The answer lies not in a single leap, but in a slow drift, a biological invitation to share the mind of another. In our ancestors, those who could anticipate a partner's move, who could rehearse a gesture in silence before trying it, who could replicate the act of cracking bone for marrow or twining fibre into thread, held an edge sharper than obsidian. They did not have to rediscover everything. They only had to watch, and then remember, and then repeat. What if survival was never a solo game? What if the real gift of our species was that we learned to learn each other? Because every stone tool left behind was not just a mark of innovation, it was a mark of repetition. Someone did it first, but someone else copied. The second hand learned from the first, and the third from the second. And across a chain of countless gestures, an entire community could be shaped by a single technique passed down without a word. How fragile that chain might seem, and yet how powerful. Because in every glance over a shoulder, in every child who squatted beside their elder, mimicking the twist of a wrist or the rhythm of a throw, the past became portable. Knowledge became air, shared, invisible, but ever present. Culture no longer lived only in things. It lived in minds. It leapt from one to another, not with fire, but with focus. And so it begins. A hand reaches for reed fibre. A child watches. A fish is scaled with an obsidian flake. A child watches. A rabbit is skinned, slowly, with practiced movements. A child watches. Across millennia, in every climate, among every band of early humans, this was the unspoken curriculum of survival. No classrooms, no lectures. Only the profound and ancient theatre of demonstration, and in that silent witnessing skill moved from elder to youth, not as invention, but as inheritance. This was not just about tools, it was about timing, knowing when to begin the hunt, when to stop, when to rest, when to move. These things are not born from instinct, they are remembered, and memory in the human world is rarely solitary. It is social, it is communal, and more than anything, it is imitative. When we think of the word learning, we often imagine struggle, trial and error, 1,000 failures before one small success. But imitation changed the equation. It reduced the cost of error. Instead of wasting seasons figuring out which routes were safe, young humans copied the gestures of those who had already survived the knowing. Instead of wandering blindly into predator dens or drinking from poisoned streams, they followed the cautious footsteps of those who had walked that land before. And so learning became layered. It became generational. You didn't just learn how to do something, you learned how someone else learned it. Their motion, their rhythm, their nuance, all of it transmitted in a quiet, visual ballet of bodies, one moving, one mimicking, and from that something even more profound emerged: patience. Because for imitation to happen, the demonstrator must allow space for the learner. They must slow down, repeat, wait, and the learner must resist impulse, observe carefully, control their body, try again. These are not just mechanical abilities, these are social ones, and they require a shared mind, a willingness to attune, to connect, to align. From these exchanges, trust was born. In many ways, imitation became the cradle of empathy. To copy another's movement is, briefly, to enter their perspective. To trace the arc of their motion is to imagine their intent. And in doing so, The lines between self and other soften. The child and the elder are no longer just separate bodies. They are echoes of the same action, the same idea, carried forward in slightly different hands. This may be why so many of the oldest human tools remained remarkably consistent for tens of thousands of years. It wasn't because people lacked creativity, it was because what worked was preserved, not in stone, but in attention. And attention has its own momentum. If something keeps you alive, you do not reinvent it. You reperform it, over and over, until it becomes reflex, until it becomes ritual, until it becomes you. And eventually the learner becomes the demonstrator, and the chain continues. A mother sharpens a flake, and the child who once watched her now shows another. The gesture travels again, unchanged, yet newly embodied. This is how culture survives the death of memory. Not because someone wrote it down, but because someone performed it again, in front of someone else. Demonstration is repetition with intent. It's one thing to act, another to be seen. And even in the deep past, there is reason to believe that humans understood this difference. They didn't merely do, they showed. In front of small groups under the canopy of trees or beside the flickering fire, people performed their competence, not for pride but for continuity. And so, a kind of quiet choreography emerged in early human life. We moved not just as individuals, but as models and mirrors for one another. One child copied a basket weaver's fingers. One hunter practiced the rhythm of a net being cast. One girl traced the same line again and again on a cave wall, until her hand knew what her mind could not yet name. This was not creativity born of chaos. It was creativity grounded in attention. Even language, that most iconic of human features, may have been shaped by the same forces. Before we spoke, we mimed. Before we described, we demonstrated. Language did not erupt. It echoed. The cadence of gesture, the pattern of movement, the shared gaze. These were the original verbs and nouns. The body spoke long before the mouth did, and it was in that embodied performance that children first learned how to belong. Belonging, after all, is not an abstract concept. It is a practiced rhythm. An imitation was the drumbeat. When young ones moved like the elders, worked like the group, nodded in time with the task, they were not only learning skills, they were learning identity. Who we are is not declared. It is shown, and it is shown in the smallest of ways. How we tie, how we sit, how we hold a stone or prepare a meal. This is why culture, once rooted, becomes durable, because it hides in habit. Not in laws, not in proclamations, but in the everyday rhythm of imitation. Culture is what we do without thinking because we once watched someone do it with care. And so, for early Homo sapiens, the power of mimicry became a survival engine. Where others had to discover, we had only to remember. Where others had to risk, we had only to repeat. This didn't mean we never invented. But it meant invention had a bedrock, a foundation, something to return to when the world changed, and when times grew hard, as they often did in prehistory, it was imitation that allowed the fastest adaptation. One individual's success could become everyone's inheritance, not through luck, but through eyes that watched and hands that remembered. And in this remembering, evolution found its shortcut. Unlike other species that relied on genetic mutations to slowly shape new behaviors over thousands of generations, humans discovered a different method, one that ran parallel to biology but moved far faster. Social learning, anchored in imitation, allowed for rapid cultural change. It meant a new hunting strategy, a better tool, or a more efficient way of storing food didn't need to arise anew in every band. It only needed to arise once. After that, it could be watched, copied, and passed on. This created a profound shift in the tempo of human survival. We were no longer bound to the slow gears of mutation and natural selection. Culture became our second genome, written not in nucleotides, but in nuance. A glance, a movement, a shared task. These became the code for adaptation, and with it came resilience. Take, for example, the making of stone blades. There is nothing obvious about flint knapping. It is counterintuitive, delicate, and demands a precise understanding of angles, pressure, and force. Yet archaeological evidence shows that early humans reproduced these methods with remarkable fidelity over vast distances and across generations. The explanation? Demonstration and mimicry. A young apprentice didn't have to understand fracture mechanics, they only had to watch. And in watching, they learned. The same holds true for fire-making, weaving, hafting, cooking, tracking, and even subtle tasks like drying skins or preparing pigments. Each of these required sequences of steps, learned not through explanation, but through example. The group became the school, the body became the book, and here we glimpse another dimension of this imitation-based learning. It required nearness. Not just physical proximity, but emotional closeness, trust, safety. A child cannot imitate well if they are afraid. An elder will not demonstrate freely if they are unwelcome. The flow of skill depended on bonds, on social fabric strong enough to hold the slow, quiet work of watching and doing. This is why imitation didn't just preserve techniques, it preserved relationships. In many ways, the ability to imitate became a kind of emotional technology. It made every person into a transmitter of experience. It extended the lifespan of knowledge beyond the body that first held it, and it wove individuals into a shared timeline, not only of how to live, but of how to be. Because to imitate is also to honour. It says, what you did mattered. It worked. It deserves to live on. And so, in this way, imitation became the first archive, not of objects, but of gestures, of rhythm, of life passed quietly from hand to hand. And through that rhythm, something astonishing emerged. Imagination. Because to imitate perfectly, one must first imagine. One must hold the image of another's movement inside the mind and replay it. This act of mental rehearsal, of seeing without seeing, became the seed of everything that followed: art, ritual, planning, and story. The mind that could mimic could also dream. When a child watched her mother twist fibres into cord, she could later twist vines into something new. When a hunter observed another's throw, he could later test a different trajectory. When one person sang a melody to match a rhythm of work, another could improvise a variation. Copying was never just duplication. It was continuity with possibility, fidelity with freedom. We learned to inherit and to transform at once. This is what made Homo sapiens not only survivors, but innovators. Our creativity did not erupt from the void, it evolved from the mimic's patience. It grew from the quiet repetition of gestures made sacred by use. The painter's hand once learned from the toolmaker's hand. The musician's rhythm was once the hammer's strike. The storyteller's cadence was once the teaching call of an elder. Every art, every idea, every dream traces its lineage back to that same ancient act. The watching, the copying, the passing on. Even now, the chain continues. Every word we speak, every movement we make, every habit we inherit from those before us carries that echo. When we need bread, tie knots, hum songs we did not write, or gesture without realizing it, we are still participating in that same imitation game, the slow transmission of being. It is easy to believe that innovation defines us, but perhaps imitation is the deeper truth. It binds generations not through novelty, but through continuity. It teaches humility, that nothing we create is truly ours alone. Every gesture belongs to a lineage of gestures, every skill to a lineage of bodies that once tried, failed, learned, and were seen. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of it all. That imitation, so often dismissed as unoriginal, was the first bridge between minds, the first shared imagination, the first way we said, without words, I see you, teach me how to be. In that seeing, humanity was born. In that repeating, humanity endured. And so the story of us is not a tale of invention after all. It is a tale of transmission, of remembering through others, of minds that mirrored and in mirroring multiplied. Because survival was never just about what we could do. It was about what we could learn. And learning, at its most ancient and most human, begins the same way it always has. A spark, a glance, a hand moving in the dark, and another smaller hand trying to follow. Some silences arrive like gentle dusk, natural, expected. Others fall like a curtain over an unfinished song. The story of humanity is haunted by such a silence. Not ours, theirs, all of them, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the robust, the clever, the strange, all gone. And here we are, their cousins, their kin, the last of our kind still whispering beneath the stars. What happens when an entire species falls still, when voices once raised in laughter, in warning, in song, fade into wind? Was their end a scream, a whimper, or something quieter still? In Western Europe, a cave reveals a skeleton with thick brows and powerful limbs. The hands, still curled, suggest purpose, perhaps even craft. In Siberia, a child's tooth carries the ghost of a lineage entirely different. Denisovan, not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens, but something else, equally human in its breath and hunger. And beneath our own skin, traces of them live on. A fraction here, a whisper of blood, a strand of bone. But what of their minds, their dreams, their last days? There was no grand war, no singular cataclysm that carved the earth open and swallowed them whole. Their disappearance was messier, slower, and perhaps more intimate than we wish to believe. It was a vanishing act written in generations, not in days, a slow retreat into the edges, then into myth, then into nothing. And yet, they were strong. Neanderthals were not clumsy brutes. They were artists, toolmakers, survivors of brutal ice ages. They buried their dead. They cared for their wounded. They survived for hundreds of thousands of years longer than modern civilizations have existed. Why did they falter? Was it climate? The Earth shifted restlessly in their final millennia. Glacial pulses and sudden warmings rearranged forests, erased food webs, pushed the resilient toward collapse. What must it have been like to watch familiar hunting grounds turn to tundra, to feel the rhythm of the seasons disjointed, as if the world had forgotten its own script? Or was it us? Because wherever they were, we followed. Not once, but over and over, across Europe, into Asia, even into remote pockets of the Middle East, always arriving, not as enemies perhaps, but as mirrors, clever, lean, flexible mirrors. Was our presence benign? Was our arrival accidental? Or did we compete, for game, for shelter, for mates? Genetic evidence tells a tangled tale. We did not just replace them, we met them, we lived with them, we bore children with them. In our genomes today, especially outside Africa, fragments of Neanderthal code remain. Echoes of skin and immune systems, of traits once honed for a harsher world, the inheritance of fire-forged resilience. But inheritance is not continuity. Those strands did not save them. Their cultures are gone, their languages unknowable, their gods, if they had them, have no names left to speak. So what does it mean to outlive your cousins? How does survival taste when it's mixed with loss? What does it mean to be alone, not by destiny, but by default? It is perhaps the loneliest triumph in our species' history, to walk into a valley once shared with others and find only our own tracks. To climb a mountain, hear our own voice echo off stone, and know it no longer returns with an answer in another tongue. It is victory wrapped in mourning, presence built upon absence. Yet the extinction of our sister species was never simple. Take Neanderthals, for example. They survived in Europe and Western Asia for at least 350,000 years, weathering ice ages and megafauna, crafting stone tools with precision, and perhaps even singing around fire. But around 40,000 years ago, their numbers thinned. The last known refugees, like the caves of Gibraltar, tell stories of dwindling footprints. Not conquest, not slaughter, just a fading. One theory speaks of climate chaos, the kind that would stress even the most seasoned foragers. Sudden cold snaps, droughts, collapsing ecosystems. In such times, small populations become vulnerable. A bad winter, a failed migration, a disease, and a lineage begins to unravel. Another theory points to us. We arrived not just as competitors, but as generalists. Where Neanderthals were masters of a place, we were wanderers, adaptable, experimental, socially flexible. Our toolkits were more varied, our diets broader, our trade networks longer. We were fewer at first, but something about our way of life allowed us to persist, to grow, to spread, and perhaps in some places we simply replaced them. Slowly, unevenly, without war, but not without consequence. But there is another truth, a more intimate one. We did not only compete, we interbred. Modern genomic analysis reveals that most people of Eurasian descent carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. These weren't passing encounters, they were unions, families, children born of shared winters and overlapping dreams. So how do we reconcile that? The people we slept beside we outlived. The lineages we joined we erased. It was not malice, necessarily. It may have been inevitability. Small populations struggle to sustain themselves across generations. They become vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and collapse. If Neanderthal groups were small and scattered, the statistical odds were already against them. We may have simply tipped the scale, and even then, there's mystery. In the Denisovans, our other close cousins, we see a similar story. Known from only a few fragments of bone and teeth, their DNA lives on in the bloodlines of Melanesians and some indigenous Australians. They too vanished, though not because they were simple. The molars suggest a robust people, the genome surprisingly diverse. They survived for a time in the shadows of Asia's mountains. Then, nothing. Silence. Not because of a single cause, but many, interwoven, like threads snapping one by one. In the end, the loss was not just of species, but of possibilities, of languages never spoken again, of songs never sung beyond a single generation, of tools whose shapes died with the hands that made them. And still we walk their lands, still we find their bones, still we ask, was it their weakness, or our survival, that silenced them? And if we were the victors, then what precisely did we win? There is a quiet truth that hides in the corners of the archaeological record. Our species did not simply endure. We endured through bottlenecks so narrow that the future of humankind teetered on the edge of disappearance. Tens of thousands of years ago, during abrupt climate collapses, we were reduced to fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals across the planet. Not an empire, not a wave, a whisper, a scattering. In these times, survival was less about dominance and more about accident. The right valley, the right season, the right group of people at the right time carrying just enough knowledge and just enough luck to make it through. The fossil record tells us that as glacial cycles deepened, habitats fragmented. Food chains broke, rainfall patterns shifted, and with them, the movement of animals, the growth of plants, the pathways of survival. Populations became islands, isolated not by water, but by aridity, by cold, by empty miles of uninhabitable land. Some of these groups, Homo heidelbergensis in Africa, archaic humans in China, disappear from the story entirely. Not with drama, not with battle, but with absence. And yet, we remained. But remaining does not mean unchanged. The story written in our genes is a story of merger, of inheritance. Homo sapiens are not a pristine lineage. We are a composite being, threads pulled from ancestors who vanished. From Neanderthals, from Denisovans, possibly even from unknown ghost lineages whose bones we have not yet found, but whose blood hums quietly inside us. In this way, extinction is not always a final severing. Sometimes it is a transformation, a passing on rather than a passing away. Still, we must sit with the uncomfortable thought that survival may have come at times at the cost of others. There is growing debate about the ways in which our ancestors may have pressured their cousins, not necessarily through violence, but through resource competition. The spread of Homo sapiens into new territories coincides eerily with the disappearance of local human groups. From Europe to Southeast Asia, our arrival was followed by silence, and that silence is not metaphor. It is measurable. It is the end of genetic variation in a population, the absence of a burial tradition, the final campfire, its ashes buried by time, a language whose final speaker grew old and passed without a successor. We tend to imagine prehistory as a place of steady progression, one species replacing another as if in a clean relay. But the reality is more entangled, messier, and deeply emotional. The extinction of our cousins is not just an event, it is a mirror. It reflects the fragility of survival, the randomness of existence, the nearness of disappearance. It reminds us that being here, alive, thinking, remembering, is not a given. It is an inheritance stitched together from those who came before and those who did not remain to see what came after. And that inheritance is not just genetic, it is behavioural, cultural. Embedded in how we respond to scarcity, how we remember loss, how we define belonging. The extinction of other human species left not only a vacuum of bodies, but of perspectives, different ways of seeing, different rhythms of thought. We imagine Neanderthals as brutish, but their tools were sophisticated. They mastered fire, shaped complex hunting strategies, and perhaps even decorated their bodies with pigments. In some caves, perforated shells smeared with ochre have been found, signs perhaps of adornment or identity. And there are hints, mere shadows, of possible burial rites. Flowers placed near the dead, bodies positioned with intention. If true, then they did not only live, they remembered. The Denisovans are more elusive. Their entire legacy, what we know of it, emerged from a single Siberian cave. A finger bone, a molar, a fragment of a skull. But what the bones could not say, the genes did. They spoke of interbreeding with Neanderthals, with modern humans, with yet another mysterious hominin. They were not isolated. They were part of the network of ancient humanity, and yet we have no art, no tools, no fire pits, only silence and fragments. It makes you wonder, how many others were there? How many hominin species have vanished without even leaving us a name? We have only recently discovered Homo naledi, deep in the dark passages of South African caves, small-brained but possibly ceremonial, and Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, tiny, tool-making and utterly strange. They too vanished. But when? Some evidence suggests they may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. In other words, until we arrived. What happens when one species with memory meets another with silence? Perhaps the truth is not that we were the chosen species, but the lucky one, or the ruthless one, or simply the one with the right mix of adaptability, sociability, and sheer chance to ride the chaos of climate and time. Climate, after all, is not just background, it is a character in this story. During the last ice age, temperatures plummeted. Glaciers crawled across continents, rainfall patterns changed, habitats shrank or shifted. In this volatility, the most specialized species often suffered. Those who relied on a narrow range of foods or a specific niche struggled to adjust. Neanderthals hunted large game, majestic creatures like woolly rhinos and giant deer. But as those animals declined, so too did their way of life. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, had learned flexibility. We fished, we trapped birds, we gathered roots, we shared food. We mapped the landscape in memory, moved with the seasons, and passed knowledge from one campfire to the next. So it was not just what we hunted. It was how we taught, how we remembered, how we mourned. Because survival is not just a skill, it is a story you keep telling. And in the silence left behind by other human species, our story grew louder, not in volume, but in presence, in continuity, in ritual, in memory passed from lips to ears over the flickering light of fire. We survived, yes. But more than that, we remembered. And in remembering, we became something different from all that came before. But this legacy comes with weight. To carry the torch of the last living human lineage is to carry a responsibility, to recognize that we did not outlast our cousins because we were better, only because we endured. Endurance is not a virtue, it is a fact, one that rests on the bones of others. In the ancient cave of Shanidar in modern-day Iraq, a Neanderthal man lay buried in sediment, crushed but not forgotten. His bones show signs of trauma, crushed ribs, a damaged eye socket, a withered arm. But he lived with these injuries for years. Someone must have cared for him, fed him, protected him. His survival was communal, his burial intentional, and in this, we are not unique. The capacity for compassion, for ceremony, for grief, it may have lived in others as it lives in us, and yet now that capacity lives in only one lineage, Homo sapiens, us. But that does not mean the others are gone entirely. Within our DNA, small traces of their presence remain. Neanderthal genes subtly shape our immune systems. Denisovan sequences influence how some people respond to altitude. Their legacy is not just in history, it is in physiology, in the quiet machinery of the body. Even today we walk through the world carrying shadows, and sometimes it feels as though the earth itself remembers. As if the wind through ancient pine groves, the cold echo of highland caves, the patterned stillness of stones, all hold a kind of whisper, not of words but of presences once felt and now gone. Not ghosts, not myths, just lives, real, lived, human lives. And so we end this chapter not with triumph, but with tenderness, because the story of our survival is also the story of those who didn't. They taught us, even if we did not know them. They walked paths we still follow. They shaped the ecosystems we inherited. And in their absence, we learned what it means to be alone, not as individuals, but as a species. We are the last of many, and now their silence is part of our sound. We carry it forward, every breath, every gesture, every story shared beneath the stars. They were cold, hungry, hunted, and yet they painted. On walls deep inside caves, where no sunlight could reach, hands reached outward, some smeared in ochre, others dusted in manganese, blackened like the outline of a fading breath. This was not shelter. These were not markings of utility. They were memories, carved in silence, preserved in darkness. And in these flickering traces of pigment and ash, left behind by a people who teetered at the edge of extinction, we glimpse a mystery that defies every expectation of what survival should look like. Because when food was scarce and danger was near, early humans didn't just hunt or hide, they made art. But why? What must it have meant to mix crushed minerals with spit and animal fat, to press one's palm flat against cold stone and blow, to leave behind not a tool, not a weapon, but a shadow of presence? Archaeologists have found these hand stencils in places like El Castillo in Spain, dating back over 40,000 years. And nearby, in the recesses of Chauvet and Lascaux, creatures once hunted, bison, deer, lions, still gallop across rock like ghosts in perpetual motion. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, and in the Kimberley region of Australia, other figures peer out with wide eyes and elongated limbs, as if painted by memory more than anatomy. These were not isolated acts. Across continents, across eons, the same impulse repeated, to mark, to record, to be seen. Yet the pigment alone tells us little. What these early murals whisper is not just about paint, but about presence. A presence so urgent it sought to echo beyond death. The oldest known cave paintings are not simple sketches. They are compositions, layered, overlapping, sometimes etched and then re-etched. They suggest not one hand but many, not one moment but an accumulation of them. Were they records, rituals, reminders? The truth may be less about classification and more about something older than language, the need to remember. Could it be that meaning itself is a survival tool? The world these people inhabited was brutal. Ice sheets advanced and retreated, devouring entire landscapes. Species vanished. Rivers flooded and dried. And in the midst of this constant unravelling, small groups of Homo sapiens, fragile, scattered, few, gathered in the hollows of earth and made something permanent. Not food, not fire, but story. The story of being here. The story of trying to last. We do not know their names, we do not know their prayers, but we know their hands, pressed against stone like petals caught mid-bloom. And if they believed, as we might, that the act of remembering could bend time, could fold it, stretch it, anchor it, then those handprints are not relics, they are reachings, not just of memory but of yearning, a yearning not to be forgotten. What happens when survival is no longer enough? When the body endures but the soul demands recognition? Perhaps you gather others. Perhaps you walk into the dark with burning pine branches, hearts beating to the rhythm of some wordless urgency. Perhaps you descend together into the breathless chambers beneath the earth, and there, in flickering shadows, you begin to trace a world not just as it is, but as it feels. And in that space between perception and expression, myth is born. It is easy to think of cave paintings as records of successful hunts, of animals seen. But many images defy that logic. Some animals are painted in places they could never have entered. Others are drawn from angles impossible to witness. There are beings with animal heads and human bodies, spirals and dots and chevrons, repeated with a kind of obsessive care. These marks are not instructional, they are symbolic, and in their abstraction they point not to the outer world, but to an inner one. The ritualized nature of these artworks suggests a form of ceremony, perhaps even religion, or proto-religion. The torchlight would have flickered across the stone, making animals appear to leap and move. Voices may have chanted, feet may have danced. The walls themselves were not silent. They pulsed with sound, story, and reverence. Some researchers believe that acoustic properties of these caves were intentionally chosen, that echoes and resonances played a role in selecting sacred spaces for painting. If so, then cave art was not visual alone, it was immersive. In this way, the paintings became more than depictions, they were invocations. And what they invoked was not just memory of an event, but the presence of something larger, a spirit, a god, a pattern beyond the human. We may never know exactly what these early artists believed, but we know they believed something. Enough to risk the climb, enough to mix colours with precious fat, enough to dedicate hours, days, to the slow, deliberate act of marking. That belief in itself is staggering. To assign meaning to a symbol is to take the first step into abstraction, and abstraction is what separates mere reaction from reflection. In that sense, these cave painters weren't simply artists. They were myth makers, and myth is not a lie. It is a lens, one that allows a community to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a shared unfolding story, a lineage, a purpose, a people. Through myth, you don't just survive the winter, you endure it with meaning. Through ritual, you don't just grieve a death, you remember a presence. Through art, you don't just live, you matter. And so, at the intersection of pigment and prayer, a new kind of inheritance began to form, one not passed in flesh or blood, but in symbol, in repetition, in the retelling of a shape, again and again, until it became a truth shared across generations. And still, we ask, why did they do it? Because in a world that offered no permanence, they carved permanence into stone. Because survival is measured not only by breath and heartbeat, but by memory and by meaning. To paint an image is to defy disappearance. It is to whisper, I was here. And more than that, we were here. But art was never just a solitary echo. It was social, communal, binding. These murals were not tucked away in the mind of a single visionary. They were collective acts created, added to, preserved by many. The process of painting together forged bonds beyond blood. In the making of art, we see the making of us. And from that us, a resilience arose that no other species could rival. Think of a group sitting around the fire, pointing to a symbol on the cave wall, a horse drawn not to scale, but in motion, a handprint left by a grandparent long gone. Think of the young ones listening, their wide eyes absorbing not only the story, but the voice that carries it, the tone, the rhythm, the silence between words. These were not passive listeners. They were participants in an unbroken ritual of remembering, and that remembering had power. Because every symbol painted, every tale retold, reinforced a collective identity, one that transcended the daily struggle. In the face of famine or flood, that shared identity didn't just comfort, it instructed. It said, we have endured before, we endure together. Art, then, was not frivolous. It was functional. Symbolism allowed ideas to travel where the body could not. It carried knowledge across time and across distance. A mark on a cave wall could become a map. A painting could teach what words could not: how to hunt, how to honour, how to fear, how to hope. In a time when writing had not yet emerged, image was the first alphabet of emotion. It encoded not facts, but feelings. And it was those feelings that bonded communities. There is evidence that many cave paintings were revisited and repainted over generations, that the act of making them was more important than the image itself. That continuity, that renewal, suggests a cultural transmission deeper than information. It was emotional inheritance. The same way lullabies carry comfort beyond language, these images carried memory beyond mortality. And in that memory there was healing, because art is not only a mirror, it is a balm. In creating images, our ancestors were also creating coherence, a narrative thread that could be followed, even when the path was unclear. Amid chaos, art reminded them that there was order. Amid death, it spoke of continuation. Even now, when we walk through those ancient caves with our electric lights and modern tools, we are not just looking at pictures. We are standing inside a message, not from the past, but from the heart of what it means to be human. And still, beneath the pigment, another question waits. Did art make us human, or did our humanity demand art? Perhaps the answer lies not in the strokes themselves, but in the spaces between them, in what was chosen to be remembered and what was left unsaid. Because art is not simply a representation, it is a decision, a selection, a shaping of the world into something we can hold. And that act of shaping, that quiet, deliberate choosing, is the very root of culture. As Homo sapiens spread across continents, the making of art spread with them. From the ochre-streaked walls of Blombos Cave in southern Africa, to the handprints in Indonesia, to the animal frescoes of Chauvet and Lascaux in Ice Age Europe, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, and yet bound by a shared instinct to leave a trace. And with those traces came more than expression. They brought cohesion. In an era where life was short, brutal, and uncertain, these symbolic acts wove a fabric stronger than sinew. They were social glue. Art gave a community something to gather around, not just in times of joy, but especially in times of loss. When someone died, it may have been a painted mark that bore their absence. When danger threatened, it may have been a carved figure that stood watch. These were not decorative objects. They were companions in the wilderness. There is reason to believe that the emergence of symbolic culture, of art, ornament and ritual, coincided with increases in population density. As groups grew larger, so too did the need for cohesion, for shared meaning, for common identity. And it is here that the survival value of art becomes unmistakable. It turns strangers into kin. Necklaces of shell or carved bone may seem simple today, but to those who wore them, they meant allegiance, belonging, maybe even love. In one burial, a young child, no older than 2, was laid to rest with a pendant and red ochre. No utility, no gain, only grief and care and memory. This is what art does. It makes the invisible visible. It allows a feeling to take form, not just in the moment, but beyond it. And that beyond is everything. Because survival is more than living. It is persisting in the memory of others. Without art, there is only forgetting. And so, these carvings, these pigments, these handprints that stretch across time, they are not simply echoes, they are anchors. They tether us to a lineage of minds that refuse to vanish without leaving something behind. They whisper that we were never alone, even when the world seemed empty. And when we stand in their presence, in the hush of a painted cavern, or in the shadows of a carved stone, we are not only witnesses, we are participants, carriers of a message that began long before us and will continue if we choose to listen. Because every mark made in darkness is also a light not only for those who made it, but for us. Distant descendants walking in their footsteps, still asking the same quiet questions. Who were we? What mattered to us? What did we long to remember? And in the soft glow of these ancient pigments, we receive our answer. Not in language, but in presence. Not in certainty, but in continuity. In the record of survival, bones tell of injury, tools speak of utility, but only art speaks of the soul. That is its power. It dares to suggest that even on the edge of extinction, beauty mattered. That amid scarcity there was still abundance of thought, of feeling, of vision. That before we built cities or carved empires, we carved meaning. Consider again the handprint, found across continents, across millennia, pressed in red ochre, outlined in charcoal negative and positive alike. It is among the oldest of human gestures, and yet it remains among the most intimate. It is the shape of presence, a declaration without words. This is me. I was here. I reached out. But even more striking is that most of these prints are not dominant hands. They are left behind by the other hand, the one held still while the pigment was sprayed, which means someone else helped. Someone else steadied the arm, prepared the paint, chose the surface. Every handprint was a duet, and so, even in silence, the art speaks of community. This is what the archaeologist cannot measure, but what the walls still hold, the quiet choreography of care, the decisions made in darkness, which figures to paint, which moments to honour, which creatures to revere. A reindeer mid-leap, a bison staring back, a spiral etched into rock looping endlessly like memory itself. We will never know the precise meaning of these forms, and maybe that is part of their magic, because they don't only transmit knowledge, they transmit wonder, they leave space for mystery, and in that mystery they make room for us, for interpretation, for connection, for reverence. In the oldest caves where pigment still clings to stone, researchers have noted how sound behaves strangely. The acoustics of those chambers amplify echoes, resonate with song. It's possible, even likely, that early humans sang there, or chanted, or drummed. That art and sound and movement formed a single thread of experience, one not meant only to be seen, but felt, lived. So perhaps these places were not galleries, but sanctuaries, not displays, but ceremonies, the beginning not of history, but of myth. And in myth, we found memory with wings, because when a people chooses to paint a horse, or a hand, or a sun, they are not merely preserving life, they are elevating it, insisting that it matters, that it meant something, that it will not be forgotten, and neither will they. It begins not in silence but in laughter, in footsteps too quick to follow, in curious fingers tracing lines in the mud. When we search the deep past for signs of genius, we often turn to tools, to bones, to marks on the wall. But there is another kind of mark, softer, more fleeting. The echo of a child's game played on the floor of a shelter, the rhythm of small feet dancing at the edge of a firelight. If we only look to the adults, we miss the secret. The future was not taught, it was imagined, and it was imagined by the young. What do we mean when we say learning? For the children of ancient bands, there were no classrooms, no scripts, no commands. There was only observation, of fire, of movement, of faces, and imitation, imperfect and spontaneous. But there was something else, a kind of chaos, a willingness to break the pattern, to test what happened if the stick was thrown instead of held, if the stone was painted instead of shaped. Adults preserved tradition, children disturbed it, and in that disturbance something new emerged. Archaeologists call it cultural transmission, but that sterile phrase hides something miraculous. Imagine a child 3 winters old watching an elder grind ochre. The elder repeats what has been repeated for generations. The child, half attentive, mimics it, then mixes in water, or smears it differently, or asks, why? That question, why, is not a small thing. It is the spark of every future ritual, every forgotten art, every tool yet to be born. In the archaeological record, it is almost impossible to find direct evidence of children. Their bones were smaller, their tools, if any, cruder. Their drawings, if made, are lost, but their fingerprints remain, on the walls of caves, in tiny handprints next to those of giants, in the layout of hearths encircled not just by labourers, but by laughter. What kind of culture allows space for its youngest members to explore freely, not once grown, but while still becoming? The answer may define us. Because it was not brute strength that ensured the survival of Homo sapiens, it was adaptability, cognitive flexibility, a species willing to try something new and to allow its children to try even more. In other animals, juvenile play fades into rigid adulthood. But in us, the play never fully ends. We are creatures of experimentation, and that experimentation begins in childhood, when failure is not yet shameful and the rules are not yet fixed. Was it the children who first discovered the floating properties of wood, who dared to mimic the sound of an animal's call and find it useful, who drew meaningless lines in the dirt that over time became symbols? What if the seeds of language were not born in instruction but in mimicry? What if the foundations of innovation were not taught but stumbled upon by the ones least expected to lead? What if it was the children who saved us? Because what adults preserved, children transformed, and not by intention but by instinct. An instinct to play, to bend the world in strange new ways, to turn tools into toys and toys into tools again. Play, in this sense, is not frivolous. It is a deep biological function, an evolutionary engine hiding beneath giggles and mischief. And through it, early humans did something astonishing. They rehearsed the unknown. In modern primates, we see glimpses of this. Young chimpanzees play with sticks as if cradling imaginary infants. Juvenile bonobos invent games that serve no immediate function. But it is in us, Homo sapiens, that this playful impulse becomes something more expansive. Unstructured learning, learning without goal, without pressure, creates a mind that is not only curious, but courageous. one that risks, tinkers, and improvises. And in the Paleolithic world, improvisation was not entertainment, it was survival. Imagine a landscape changing, ice creeping forward, prey migrating away, rivers drying. The old ways falter. What remains? The child, whose hands never learned the correct way, finds a new one, and what begins as a mistake becomes tradition in a single generation. It is through children that adaptation accelerates. They are not bound to legacy. They imitate, but imperfectly, and sometimes beautifully. We often imagine ancient human life as severe, harsh climates, grim faces, constant toil, but this is incomplete. Within every small band there were moments of joy, of mischief, of small voices singing nonsense to the trees. Children humanized time, they slowed it. They asked questions the adults forgot how to ask, and in their play they created space for surprise. In many hunter-gatherer societies still surviving today, we see this same principle alive. Children are not coddled, but neither are they confined. They are allowed to explore the edges of the forest, of behaviour, of understanding. They watch elders but are not forced into instruction. They play near the fire, near the tools, near the rituals, and in that nearness something transfers, not just knowledge, but possibility. Neuroscientists today speak of cognitive flexibility, the brain's ability to switch strategies, to adjust patterns, to invent alternatives. This flexibility is highest in youth, and in the Pleistocene world that flexibility wasn't academic, it was existential. The child who learned to play with a snare might one day revolutionize hunting. The child who babbled strangely might invent a phrase. The child who copied poorly might accidentally create a better method. Failure in this context is not failure, it is a divergent path, and the human lineage is filled with divergent paths that began in the minds of the young. It's easy to overlook the role of children in the prehistoric story. Their traces are soft, their inventions anonymous, but the very things we now call human, innovation, language, creativity, all carry the fingerprints of minds unafraid to play. Minds that asked, what happens if? And sometimes the answer was everything. A new way to lash a stone to wood. A novel path across the mountain range. A strange word that catches on. These are the quiet revolutions that never announce themselves. The ones sparked not in councils or ceremonies, but in moments of unobserved play. They are born when no one is looking, and often it is the child who lights the match. Archaeological traces of childhood are elusive but not absent. In some Paleolithic sites, miniature tools have been found, too small to be practical, but expertly crafted. At first, these puzzled researchers. Why would someone make a perfect spear point, only to leave it unused? The answer may be deeply human. These were practice tools, teaching tools, or even toys. In the cave of La Gama in Spain, there are traces of small footprints, the kind made by children, dancing in circles far from the main art panels. These weren't ceremonial markings, they were moments, laughter maybe, or play acting something no adult understood. But those footprints are a reminder that childhood itself is ancient, and its contributions profound. Even language, that crown jewel of Homo sapiens, may have grown from the rough soil of childish experimentation. Before formal grammar, before structured meaning, there were sounds, and those sounds were first played with by tongues not yet tamed. Babel is the original laboratory. It is in the sounds that didn't matter that meaning eventually emerged. Linguists believe children, in their flexible neural states, were the primary drivers of language innovation, bending inherited noises into new communication forms. The paradox is striking. Those with the least experience contributed the most novelty. The youngest were the ones who dared stray furthest from the known, and the group that allowed for such deviation, that made room for its wildness, became the one most capable of changing. It would be tempting to think that our ancestors merely survived because of strength, cooperation, or luck. But that is only part of the truth. The full picture includes the delicate, half-formed minds that questioned the obvious, that mixed up the patterns, that broke the rules before they were written. And the cultures that endured were not the ones that silenced the child's impulse, but those that honoured it. In evolutionary terms, risk is dangerous, but without it, there is no leap forward. Adults conserve, children disturb, and in that disturbance lies the seed of progress. That is the hidden rhythm of survival, a dance between remembering and reinventing. We are in part the descendants of those who played, and were allowed to. And so, we might say that the campfires of prehistory were not just ringed by adults teaching children, they were shaped by children reteaching the species. With each game, each odd phrase, each reckless question, they didn't just reflect culture, they nudged it forward. And when the ice moved in, it was these small nudges that sometimes made all the difference. To adapt quickly in a world that was always shifting, through drought, through fire, through cold, meant that Homo sapiens had to be more than just resilient. We had to be experimental, and for that we leaned not just on the strength of our elders, but on the open minds of our youngest. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to change strategies, to reframe problems, to try something new, peaks early in life. In children, the brain is not yet optimized for efficiency. It is still forming pathways, still weighing possibilities. This means children are naturally more likely to try multiple solutions, to combine ideas in unusual ways, and to question what adults accept. It's not chaos, it's exploration. In prehistoric bands, where survival hinged on innovation as much as tradition, these qualities weren't just useful, they were essential. Imagine a group of foragers approaching a region where the familiar plants no longer grow, where the migration patterns of animals have shifted. The knowledge of elders matters, yes, but what of the child who asks, what if we try this plant? What if we wait here instead? What if we follow the birds? That kind of mental looseness, that refusal to fixate, gave our species options, and in an uncertain world, options were lifelines. Risk-taking, too, was a feature, not a flaw. Childhood is one of the longest stages in the animal kingdom for humans. We are born helpless, and we remain dependent for years. At first glance, this seems inefficient. Why wouldn't evolution favour faster development, more self-sufficient offspring? But the answer lies in the long runway that childhood provides. More time means more learning, more play, more opportunity to experiment within the safe boundaries of a social group. It gives the developing brain room to explore not just what is, but what could be. This long childhood is what allowed for the emergence of complex technologies, symbolic thinking, and intricate social structures. Children, in their protected time of curiosity, weren't just absorbing culture, they were expanding it. In this light, the child was not just a future adult in training, they were a present force, a creative engine. While adults refined tools, children imagined new ones. While elders passed on rules, children questioned them. While communities settled into seasonal rhythms, children disrupted them, sometimes with failure, but sometimes with breakthrough. The presence of children, then, wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a cultural asset, and perhaps it still is. When we picture early human societies, we often see the strong, the hunter, the builder, the leader. But survival, true, long-term survival, rested equally in smaller, messier hands. It pulsed in the laughter around the fire, in the chaos of a game, in the question asked for the 100th time, because sometimes it is only in that asking, that repeating, that playing, that the future begins to take shape. And so, if we step back from the grand arcs of migration, invention, and extinction, if we listen past the roar of glaciers and the silence of forgotten species, we might hear something gentler beneath it all, a child humming, a question asked not for an answer but for wonder's sake, a hand reaching into unknown soil, not with fear but with play. This is what we often forget in the story of survival. We tell ourselves that it was the wise, the experienced, the hardened who led our species through fire and famine, but sometimes it was the ones with scraped knees and unfinished sentences who sparked something truly new. The ones too young to know the rules, and therefore unafraid to break them. Consider, for example, the introduction of new tool types. While much of the refinement of stone blades or bone needles surely involves skilled adult hands, the leap to try something different, to combine materials, to reverse a process, to make something smaller or stranger, may well have come from the young. Not because they were trying to improve survival, but because they were playing. And when those small, accidental changes worked, when they made a fire catch faster or a snare more reliable, they were noticed, they were copied, they were folded into the fabric of what worked and what would be passed on. The same goes for language. Some linguists believe that children are not only the best learners of language, they may also be the best inventors of it. In communities where adults spoke fragmented dialects or newly blended tongues, it was often the children who regularized grammar, created structure, and transformed chaos into something coherent. They didn't do this out of scholarly intent. They did it by playing, by talking, by trying, and in doing so created tools for thought more powerful than any spear. In that sense, the child was both mirror and flame. They reflected what the community gave them, yes, but they also lit fires of their own. Fires that, over generations, illuminated paths no adult could have imagined alone. And here lies one of the great paradoxes of our evolution. We are a species defined by memory, by tradition, by the careful passing of knowledge from one hand to the next. And yet, what made us most resilient was our ability to forget, to play, to risk, to try again. That ability, seeded in the minds of children, may have been what kept us just a few steps ahead of extinction. While other species specialized, we explored. While others perfected, we improvised. And while others followed instinct, we followed curiosity, often led by the smallest among us. So tonight, as you listen to the ancient echoes of your own bloodline, remember this: the future of humanity was once held not in the hands of the strong, but in the hands of those still learning how to hold anything at all. There are truths that live not in stone, not in fire, not even in story, but in feeling. And among the most ancient of these is this: we survived not because we were ruthless, but because we were kind. When the glaciers crept and the predators circled, and the dark pressed close, it was not brute force that made us human. It was something quieter, something deeper, a flicker behind the eyes, a reaching toward the other, the soft, irrational instinct to care. But where does such a thing begin? Not in logic, not in law. Empathy, that root of all our belonging, does not sprout from the skull. It coils from the nervous system outward, an inheritance older than tools. Scientists studying mirror neurons in primates have shown that when one being watches another act, the same patterns of neural fire flicker within them, a bridge of understanding, not built by reason, but by resonance. We did not learn empathy, we remembered it. Was it already there, waiting in the bodies of those who held each other through winters they could not explain? Imagine a mother whose child is not her own, cradled against her chest in the cave's rear while the child's parents hunt. Imagine a man who limps, one leg damaged, carried in a sling made of woven sinew, while the group migrates slowly toward shelter. These were not abstractions, these were real people, and their lives endured not in isolation but in connection. We see it in the bones, in healed fractures, in aged joints, in ancient spines curved by time, not by trauma. A child buried with antler beads laid carefully on their chest, an elder interred with ochre and charred offerings. These were not the gestures of efficiency. They were the gestures of reverence, of meaning beyond survival. But why did it matter? Because to be alone was death. To be seen was life. And somewhere in the tangle of this emotional network something else emerged, a sense of rightness, of what should be, not by commandment, but by intuition. The moral sense, biologists call it now. But long before we could name it, we obeyed it, not always, not purely. But enough to reshape the arc of our species. What happens when compassion becomes instinct? Perhaps we begin to build not just tools, but communities. Not just safety, but belonging. In one site in Israel, archaeologists uncovered a grave where a man lay curled beside a woman, their heads adorned with shells and red pigment. Their bones tell no story of violence, only ritual, only peace. And so we must ask, who were they to each other? And who was watching when they were buried? Even grief, it seems, is a sign of life. A sign that the mind no longer sees the world as self and other, but as us, as we. And in this way, evolution twisted inward, not toward muscle or speed, but toward sensitivity, toward softness. The very thing that breaks us also binds us. And from this ache, we became more than creatures. We became companions. What forest grows from roots like that? A forest of minds, entangled not just by genes or needs, but by feelings that loop and spiral like vines, curious, conflicted, yearning. For most of human history, our survival depended on a physical landscape. Rivers, game trails, the arc of the sun. But the inner landscape, our emotional terrain, was just as vital, and it too was shaped over millennia. It grew rituals, it grew tenderness, and somewhere within its canopy, it grew a sense that death was not the end. Ritual burial did not begin as religion, it began as remembrance. The first graves we found are neither elaborate nor consistent, but they are deliberate. In Shanidar Cave, in what is now Iraq, a Neanderthal body was discovered laid in a shallow depression, surrounded by traces of pollen, wild flowers placed carefully beside the corpse. Was it mourning? Was it hope? We cannot know, but we do know this. Someone returned to the body, someone paused, someone marked the moment with beauty, and then they let go. In that moment, something profound occurred. Our ancestors began to treat the dead not as discarded bodies, but as vessels of meaning. Burial became more than disposal. It became communication, a story told not to the living, but to the mystery beyond them. Perhaps it was the first quiet question. Where do we go? And just as important, who will remember us? These were not idle thoughts. They were adaptive. Groups that held on to members longer, who protected the sick, the frail, the grieving, gained more than numbers. They gained memory. They gained stability. They gained trust. And trust, unlike strength, could be passed between minds like fire between hands. A dying grandmother, held by her kin, may have passed down knowledge of when the rains come, or how to prepare a bitter root. A child cradled in a storm may have survived only because someone chose to care. This was not sentiment, it was strategy. But strategy has side effects. Because when you begin to feel the pain of another as your own, something else emerges. Not fear, but awe, wonder. A gaze lifted beyond the body towards something larger, something shared. The earliest spiritual symbols found on bone and cave wall are not declarations. They are mysteries, spirals, hands, eyes, suns, not depictions of gods, but invitations into meaning, into connection, into the unseen. And once that door opened, we never shut it again. Empathy, first a flicker, then a flame, lit the path toward myth, toward metaphor, toward that strange human need to explain, to belong, to offer thanks even when there is no reply. We did not invent religion to control. We stumbled into it like a child whispering to the stars, not for answers, but for intimacy, because even then we were not just surviving the world, we were surviving ourselves, and in this inner wilderness, this forest inside, our ancestors planted seeds they would never see bloom. Compassion became not just a trait, but a legacy, and legacies, once rooted, are hard to tear out. From those roots grew something even more astonishing: identity. Not merely as individuals, nor even as families, but as us, the wordless perimeter of belonging. The shift from "this is my fire" to "this is our fire," from "I remember" to "we remember." This subtle recalibration rewired the survival game. It changed who was worth helping. It redrew the boundary lines between friend and stranger. In doing so, it created the group, not just as a cluster of bodies, but as a cognitive reality. To belong was to be seen, to matter, and in dangerous, uncertain environments that mattered deeply. Modern humans carry this inheritance still. The craving for inclusion, the sting of shame, the rituals of welcome and exile. These instincts did not arise in cities. They bloomed in the dark, in the hush of small bands crouched beneath the stars, wrapped in furs, tracking the eyes of others for approval, for safety, for kinship. The forest inside us was pruned by these pressures, and one of the most powerful tools in that landscape was the shared story. Stories were not just entertainment, they were social glue. Long before writing, before even language as we know it, there were rhythms, repeated patterns, gestures that meant danger, looks that said yes. Then came tales, about animals, about the sky, about who we are and where we come from. The story was a vessel for emotion, a bridge across minds, and to tell it well was to rise in status, to gain influence, to be trusted. The storyteller became a kind of leader, not by dominance but by connection. In these stories morality emerged, not as law but as intuition. The hero returns the favour. The thief is shamed. The kind are remembered, the cruel are cast out. No courts, no commandments, just the slow, steady encoding of what helps us live together. As children listened wide-eyed and elders nodded by the fire, the boundaries of what it meant to be human were reinforced, not through punishment, but through parable. And over time, these parables crystallized. Across the world, ancient burials begin to show similar patterns, the dead painted with ochre, laid facing the east, placed with beads, tools, or animal bones. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of meaning left in the soil, evidence not of doctrine, but of yearning, for order, for peace, for transcendence. These practices weren't only for the dead, they were for the living. To bury a body was to bury a piece of the group. It demanded ritual, memory, context, and in performing that ritual the group renewed itself. The mourners became one. Identity, stretched across time, wove the present to the past and the past to the future. This was survival by story. And in that story we didn't just tell who we were, we decided who we would be. That choice, soft, unconscious yet ever present, guided how we shaped the group, and in doing so, how we shaped the self. In the glacial twilight of the Pleistocene, survival wasn't just about knowing where to find roots or how to nap a flint blade. It was about aligning one's heart with the invisible currents of the group mind. Those who could not feel what others felt, who could not anticipate hurt or joy in another's face, were left behind, not by cruelty, but by entropy. A tribe burdened with selfishness could not hold. So, empathy became not just a virtue, it became an advantage. Modern neuroscience points us back to that ancient hearth. Mirror neurons found in human brains and a few of our primate cousins fire not only when we act, but when we see someone else act. When one gathers berries, another learns. When one stumbles, the others flinch. This mirroring allowed learning, yes, but it also fostered connection. The pain of another could become one's own. The triumph of another could lift the group. We were not just living together, we were feeling together, and that feeling made us powerful. In the wild, no single body could match a lion, but a bonded group, a web of watching eyes and listening hearts, could hold firm. It could strategize, divide tasks, bear burdens, grieve losses, anticipate needs, even suffer together. Pain became bearable, not because it lessened, but because it was shared. In this space of collective resonance, rituals deepened. Rituals, after all, are synchronized emotion. A birth chant, a mourning cry, a dance in the rain. They encode memory not in stone, but in the body. They do not need language to function, only rhythm, repetition, and presence. Even today, rituals mark transitions. The naming of a child, the crossing into adulthood, the farewell to the dying. These are not new behaviours. They are ancient scripts written in the pulse, humming through the bloodline. And in the oldest rituals, awe took root. Awe, the breathtaking stillness before thunder, the hush at a mountain summit, the chill of watching your own breath under stars. It is not a distraction from survival. It is survival, because awe slows us down. It quiets the noise. It binds the group in reverent silence. In awe we find not just humility, but belonging. We are small, yes, but we are small together. This shared humility may have been one of our greatest adaptations. In a world where arrogance could get you killed, where ignoring a warning or hoarding food meant exile, humility served. It opened the way for teaching, for deference, for cooperation across generations. It reminded each person that they were not the centre of the world, but part of something older, wider, and enduring. This is the forest inside, not of trees but of feelings, a canopy of instincts that whisper not survive alone, but endure together. An ecology of the soul tuned not only to danger and hunger, but to empathy, wonder, and grace. And it was in this internal forest that the future of our species took shape. Because when the world around us froze, cracked, and shifted, when herds vanished and skies turned red, it was not the strongest who endured, but those most connected, those who remembered a name spoken in grief, those who waited for the slowest, those who shared the last strip of dried meat. This is not sentimentality, it is biology, it is strategy. A tribe was not a collection of individuals, It was a memory engine, a resilience machine, and each heartbeat in it carried not only blood, but meaning. Burial too arose in this matrix of meaning. We sometimes think of burials as signs of religion, but before they were spiritual, they were relational. To place the dead carefully into the earth, to tuck a bone tool or red ochre beside them, was to say, you mattered, you belonged, you will be remembered. Even now, the earliest known intentional burials, like those of Neanderthals in Shanidar Cave, speak not of doctrine, but of affection, a flower pressed into grave dust, a hand arranged gently on a chest. In those moments, we see not belief in gods, but belief in each other, and from this emotional core, belief itself would rise. Belief was never just about the stars or the spirit world. It was about the story we told of ourselves, who we are, why we are here, what we owe each other. Myth was not a fantasy. It was a compass, a stabilizer in chaos, a soft place to land when logic fell short. Through stories, a group could reinforce its values. Through shared imagination, it could shape identity, and in that identity it could find strength. The tribe then became more than bodies around a fire. It became a vessel of memory, a structure of trust. A forest of minds growing toward the same sun. Group identity is not a modern invention. It is prehistoric, older than writing, older than cities. In the calls of ritual, the echoes of grief, the rhythm of dance, we found not only survival, but selfhood. One that extended outward, held by others, one that could stretch across time. And here lies the paradox of our inner evolution. To survive the harshest environments, we turned inward. We did not grow sharper claws or thicker hides. We cultivated tenderness, reverence, imagination, and with them, a kind of invisible architecture, an internal ecology that outlasted ice, drought, and darkness. This is the forest inside. It is the part of us that flinches when others cry, that sings when we fall in love, that pauses to watch the wind move through tall grass. It is not primitive. It is not soft. It is the oldest tool we carry and the quietest. It does not crack bones or light fires, but it builds bridges across the hardest years of human life. And in the end, it is this, more than any spearhead or shelter, that explains why we endured. Even now, in the quiet hum of cities and the flicker of digital light, we carry the echo of a much older truth. We were never alone. Survival was never a solo act. It was not the triumph of the strongest, nor the cleverest, nor the fastest. It was the endurance of those who connected, who depended, who wove their lives into others. In the grand theatre of prehistory, with ice pressing down from the north and predators stalking the shadowed edges of firelight, the real miracle was not conquest. It was care. What if the greatest invention wasn't a tool but a bond? What if, in the slow churn of millennia, the most decisive adaptations didn't come from the hands but from the heart? Interdependence, so easy to overlook, so quiet in its work, became the scaffold of our kind. In small bands we hunted, in smaller circles we grieved, and in the soft light of dusk as elders passed down stories, the fabric of belonging was reinforced again and again. This, perhaps, is what the other human species never mastered fully. Not fire, not tools, but the vast invisible net of trust that stretches between individuals. Across continents and across generations, this net held us. It caught the sick and the weak. It tethered the brave to the cautious, the dreamers to the doers. In times of scarcity, it distributed. In moments of grief, it soothed. It was invisible, but essential. How do you measure something like that? Not with stone tools or fossilized bones, not with genetic markers or isotopic signatures. And yet the evidence is there, inscribed not in artifacts but in patterns. The long lives of injured individuals, the burial of infants, the communal hearths that burn beyond the needs of heat or meat. These are not signs of utility, they are signs of value, of time spent not on survival, but on something softer, stranger. Love, perhaps, or duty, or meaning. And meaning, it turns out, is the oldest survival skill of all. It is what binds one breath to the next, one life to the others. When the cold crept in and the herds moved elsewhere, it was not strength that kept us moving, it was faith in each other. Faith that someone would carry the child, that someone else would remember the path, that a third would know where the water ran sweet in the spring thaw. In that faith, we passed through bottlenecks. In that trust, we outlived the silence that claimed our cousins. Why did only one human species survive? That question haunts every cave painting, every buried jawbone, every shard of obsidian struck just so. But maybe it is the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, how did we remain together? And if we owe our survival not to separation but to connection, not to dominance but to reciprocity, what kind of legacy does that leave in our bones? What does it mean to be the inheritor of a lineage held together not by power, but by care? It means that the core of our being was shaped not on the anvil of war or conquest, but in the tender repetitions of mutual need. The mother who shared her portion with the child of another, the scout who delayed the group's departure to wait for the limping elder. These are not the moments that leave behind bones or artifacts, but they are the ones that sculpted the very structure of our minds. We are not designed for solitude. We are not optimized for isolation. From the beginning, our bodies were social, our cognition collective. To see this clearly, we must widen our gaze. The same hands that shaped flint tools also shaped one another's fates. The brain that learned to hunt antelope also learned to read a furrowed brow, a child's whimper, a friend's silent pause. Neurobiology reveals this ancient truth in modern light. Mirror neurons, social-emotional pathways, the hormonal orchestra of oxytocin and endorphins. These are not new, they are prehistoric. Evolutionarily ancient, and they speak of a design rooted in interconnection. But the proof does not lie only in the past. The legacy lives on in us, in our instincts, in our habits, in the quiet craving for eye contact, in the way children seek touch before they seek tools, in the way loneliness today burns not as inconvenience but as pain. We were made to matter to each other, made to reflect, to resonate, to belong. And that inheritance was never trivial. Because relationships were not a luxury in the Paleolithic. They were the environment. No matter the external climate, no matter the predator or the prey, the primary context in which every early human lived was social. Within these social matrices, survival strategies flourished. It wasn't just the spear that mattered. It was who held the other end of the hunt, who shared the meat, who mourned the death. In this social fabric, the innovations of survival didn't scatter. They took root. They stayed. That is why knowledge survived even when people perished. That is why techniques of tool-making, fire-starting, tracking, and storytelling moved across generations without writing. Because they moved along relationships. They were encoded not in scrolls, but in memory, ritual, and trust. And to this day, the deepest skills, the ones that endure, are passed not through formal instruction, but through the warmth of human proximity. A hand guiding another hand, a child watching a parent, a friend repeating a tale until the words no longer need rehearsal. Our species' genius, then, was not in what we built, but in how we bound. In times of catastrophe, it wasn't the most brilliant individual who ensured continuity. It was the tightest network, the group that held, the clan that adapted together, the bond that could flex, absorb, adjust. So if we think of survival as solitary, we misunderstand our own origin story. We are here because someone else once looked at a struggling child, a broken limb, a fading ember, and did not walk away. They stayed. And in staying, they defied the most primal law of the wilderness, that only the strong survive. In the calculus of raw nature, vulnerability is weakness. But in the calculus of humanity, vulnerability became invitation. It beckoned help, not abandonment. And so, against the backdrop of a world red in tooth and claw, Homo sapiens introduced a new equation, one where the injured were carried, the dying were comforted, and the hungry were fed. This was not sentimentality, it was strategy, cooperation, scaled across time, outcompeted brute strength. Empathy, when shared across kinship lines and tribe boundaries, built alliances that could outlast droughts, famines, and cold spells. A hand stretched outward became more useful than a fist clenched inward. That shift, from individual resilience to relational endurance, was as evolutionary as it was emotional. Even when the world changed, this truth endured. In the bitter snap of the younger Dryas, in the long twilight of Ice Age winters, survival did not depend solely on who could hunt, but on who could be trusted. Scarcity did not breed savagery, more often it bred ingenuity. Group sharing networks expanded, food was redistributed. Fire pits became sites of nightly congregation, not just for warmth, but for recalibration, for reassessing what the group knew, what it needed, and who had what to offer. The gift economy of ancient bands ran on memory and meaning. A mammoth haunch today might mean fish in spring. A bone needle given freely could mean shelter shared weeks later. Reciprocity was not always immediate, but it was essential, and the memory of generosity was as important as the act itself. Those who remembered who had helped were also those who were remembered when help was needed. In this way, relationship became currency. Memory became survival, but it went deeper still. Because something strange happens when a species evolves to prioritize others. We begin to change what we see when we look at the world. A stream becomes not just water, but a shared destination. A trail becomes not just a path, but a route handed down from mouth to ear to foot. An animal becomes not just prey, but symbol, ritual, myth. In other words, interdependence gave rise to something even more profound: imagination. The ability to imagine what another person feels, fears, remembers. The ability to imagine a future self, or a future descendant. The capacity to mourn the dead, to sing to the unborn, to bury not just bones but beliefs. These were not accidents. They were the side effects of a mind tuned not merely to survive but to connect. And so, as our ancestors walked across continents and outlasted every other cousin species, they did not do so as conquerors. They moved as weavers, threading networks of kin, memory, hope. Theirs was not the path of dominance, but of entanglement. They survived because they never travelled alone, even when the path was empty. Because even solitude for them was populated by memory. A hunter moving through dense forest did not walk in silence. He carried the voices of ancestors, the gestures of teachers, the warnings and songs passed down around glowing embers. Every landmark was a story. Every trail was a thread in a web spun by countless feet before his own. This was not merely environmental knowledge, it was cultural cartography. The map of meaning laid atop the map of terrain, and this layering of memory upon place, of identity upon survival, meant that their relationships extended beyond the living. Ritual burials, evidence of grave goods, and even ochre-stained bones suggest that the early Homo sapiens carried with them an awareness of something more than the moment. They remembered, they mourned, and perhaps they believed, not in gods as we might define them now, but in continuities, in patterns that did not end with breath, in the idea that connection transcended time. What emerged from this was not just survival, but society. Shared values, shared griefs, shared joys. The structures that held our ancestors together were not built of stone or timber. They were built of recognition. To be human was to be seen, to be held in mind by others. And in this, something irreversible took hold. The individual became inseparable from the collective. Even those who failed, who stumbled in the hunt, who could not bear children, who bore wounds or illnesses, were remembered, cared for, spoken of. This is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the past, that those long extinct did not vanish unaccompanied. They were carried in story, in bone, in gesture, just as we are. Today, even now, the whisper of that ancient network lives on. In the lullabies we sing to children who don't yet speak. In the hands we hold without words. In the instinct to comfort, to include, to honour. These are not modern inventions, they are echoes. And it is this echo that challenges the modern myth of the lone survivor. We are taught to imagine the human as an individualist, an innovator breaking new ground alone. But the archaeological record, the genetic record, the emotional record, they say otherwise. The greatest innovations did not emerge in isolation. They were co-created. Toolkits were refined through shared repetition. Myths were sculpted through communal performance. Languages blossomed in the space between lips, not within a single mind. Even today, when we face technological frontiers or global crises, the answers are never solo. They are symphonic. And if we forget that, if we pretend that our species succeeded by separating rather than by connecting, we do not just dishonour the past, we endanger the future. Because the great lesson of Homo sapiens is not that we were the strongest or the smartest. It is that we were the most interwoven, that our success was not an ascent but an entanglement, a million strands braided through time, still holding, still humming, still here. Even now, in the modern world of screens and satellites, the remnants of that ancient braid persist. When a stranger stops to help a fallen cyclist, when a community gathers after loss, when knowledge is passed not in manuals but in stories whispered over tea, those are echoes of the same survival instinct that once warmed us around Paleolithic fires. They are not remnants of a simpler time. They are the reason we are still here, because what kept our ancestors alive is not so different from what keeps us whole today. Cooperation, not competition, empathy, not indifference. And when we reach into our past, not just for data but for wisdom, we begin to see something startling. The real legacy of the Stone Age was not the tool, it was the tenderness, not the spear, it was the song. We tend to think of prehistory as brutal, and yes, it was harsh. Death came often and early. The margins were thin, but look closer, and you will find compassion etched into bone, healing in fractured limbs, care in worn teeth of the elderly who could no longer chew but were still fed. These are the footprints of a people who refused to reduce value to utility, who understood that the weakest member reveals the strength of the whole, and this is what we inherit, not just their DNA, but their decisions. Their silence too speaks. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the unnamed cousins whose faces we can only guess, all of them lived, felt, loved, and all of them ended, not because they failed, but because we endured. Randomness chose us, a shift in wind, a lucky migration, a mutation hidden deep in a strand of code. We did not earn our survival, we received it, which means we owe, not out of guilt, but gratitude, for every hand that held another instead of letting go, for every risk taken to carry someone who might not make it, for every word spoken into the dark that kept someone tethered. These were the forgotten technologies of survival, invisible, immeasurable, but indispensable. So now, as the last of our kind, we stand at the edge of an unthinkable inheritance. We are not alone because we have each other. We are not alone because we carry every ancestor who ever reached out and touched another with kindness. We are not alone because the very architecture of our mind, its longing for connection, its ache for belonging, is not a weakness, but a map home. And perhaps that is the final truth of our kind. We never stood apart. We were never chosen for greatness. We simply remembered, again and again, to turn toward one another. In firelight, in famine, in joy, in grief, in silence, in story. And in doing so, we became something no other species could quite become. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most numerous, but the most remembered, because we were never alone, and we never had to be. Thank you, fellow sapien, for walking this long road through the memory of our kind, tracing not just tools or timelines, but the quiet breath behind them, the firelight flicker of those who dreamed us into being. If this story helped you feel the warmth of ancient kinship, sparked a sense of wonder at the minds that came before, or simply offered a still moment to reflect, thank you for spending this time with us. Perhaps a single image stayed with you, a face drawn in ochre, the soft weight of a child's hand in ritual, or the shimmer of empathy passed between strangers. Whether it was the image of pigment on stone, the soft echo of a buried cradle, or the shared silence in the hunt. These fragments are what connect us across time, each one a thread we hold together. If any of these moments linger with you, I invite you to share them in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering to this growing circle of reflection. And if you'd like to wander further down these hidden paths with us, you can subscribe or share this story. There are still more echoes to follow, more questions buried in the dark, waiting. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful.